today we're going to be talking about advocacy in this next session, and I hope that you will participate and be part of this session, and I hope you'll stay even after this, because we're going to have a State of Black America panel, which is going to be very, very great, strong after this. We're going to talk about the science of advocacy, and then I'm going to give you guys a couple of tips on how to engage in congressional advocacy, as well as in your state legislature or maybe your city council. Before I get to the presentation, I'm going to give you my disclaimers. The science of advocacy and what I'm going to talk about today is, this is not my attempt to try to sway you one way or another about any particular issue. We're going to look at advocacy first as a science, techniques, ways to influence people. I didn't create these techniques. I'm going to tell you about some of the techniques, and then I'm hoping that through some of it, I can just tell you a little bit about how, in my personal life, how maybe some of these techniques have been used for good, or how I've seen some of these techniques used for not so good. So this presentation was supposed to, let me also give you this caveat. This presentation was supposed to be given to you by my best friend in the whole world, Attorney James Williams, who was going to fly up from New Orleans, and he was going to make this presentation. And then I was going to do the second half of the presentation today, which is about congressional advocacy. Well, he informed me late last night that a judge that he has a trial before of would not let him come. She has a trial, and Judge Irons, Paulette Irons, who's a good friend of mine, said, nope, you can't come. So I said, well, James, you failed at your advocacy in convincing the judge that you should be here in Washington. So I received his PowerPoint at 10:30 a.m. this morning. But as a good friend, he wrote a script for me that I can follow, and I've seen his PowerPoint before, and I hope you will still get what you need to get from it. But he's put a lot of time and energy into it. So I do want to give him the credit and thank him for putting this together, and hopefully I can deliver it as effectively as he would have delivered it. I have been a practicing attorney since 1998, and I've utilized many of these same techniques we're going to talk about today, both in my private world as an attorney. I served as a state legislator in Louisiana, as a state senator, as a state representative. I used a lot of these things to get legislation passed. People use a lot of these techniques to help me pass legislation. And when I came to Washington, I got an opportunity to serve as a chief of staff on Capitol Hill. And so even though I'm not the multi-million-dollar trial lawyer that my friend James is, I've had an opportunity to utilize some of these same techniques as well. So let's talk about the science of advocacy, what it means, and I will do the best I can to relay this presentation that he put together for you. The first technique I want to talk about this morning is known as the human automatic action. The human automatic action. It's a well-known principle of human behavior which provides that we will be more successful when asking someone to do us a favor if we provide a reason for the request. We can be much more successful if we ask someone to do us a favor, to do something for us, if we provide a reason for making the request. And this psychological principle was first proven in an experiment by Harvard social scientist Ellen Langer. In Dr. Langer's study, she staged scenarios in a real office setting involving workers who are waiting in line to use the copy machine. And God knows we have that issue sometimes even at our office in Washington, D.C. We've got one big copy machine for the office, right, or some sections, and Kim Atterbury has copies to make. She's printing out a whole bunch of name tags or something for this deal, and somebody's got an emergency, and Kyle needs to make copies first, right? And what Dr. Langer studied was, what she did was, as the workers waited in line, someone approached them asking them to skip the line and to use the copy machine immediately. Sometimes the person asking to skip the line gave a reason for making the request, and sometimes the person asking to skip the line gave no reason for making the request. The Harvard scientists observed a significant difference in the success rate between those persons who articulated a reason for the need to skip and those persons who articulated no reason at all. So for example, some people asked to skip the line and just said, I'm in a rush. Can I make copies? Those persons were successful 94% of the time being allowed to skip. And you've seen this at the airport. You've seen those folks who've gotten to the security line late, they've got a flight, and even though you're sitting there saying you should have left early, if they ask to skip, 9 times out of 10, someone will say, go ahead. Even if you're upset, even if it makes you late for your own plane, 9 times out of 10, people say, go ahead. Under those circumstances, when no reason was articulated, just can I make a copy, only 60% of the time were people successful. 90 to 60. Now, some of you may argue that the difference between it was compassion, right? People are compassionate people. Maybe they were good people and they just wanted to let someone have a copy. They were just nice people. In other words, the person who said, I'm in a rush, had a better success rate, not because of some psychological factor, but because people sympathize with the fact. I know some of you are probably thinking that. This potential debunking of the human automatic action principle led Dr. Langer to conduct additional studies, where the person requesting to skip the line gave a nonsensical reason. Just gave a nonsensical reason. A reason like, excuse me, but I use copy machine because I have to make copies, was the reason they gave. And even though a reason articulated was nonsensical, 93% of the time, they were allowed to skip. This technique is properly deployed as an effective alternative to trying to convince someone that you are right and that they are wrong. Many times when we're trying to advocate on legislation, or we're even trying to advocate in our personal relationships, we take the tack, I'm right, you're wrong, you should see things my way. What this study shows, and what this principle shows, is that if you give a reason as to why you're right, without even addressing that someone else may be wrong, you just give a reason as to you're right, chances are that sometimes you can get the result you want just by giving a reason. Just by giving a reason. Therefore, a right versus wrong technique could actually make persuading someone even more difficult sometimes. We've run into that in even your personal relationships. I'm right, you're wrong, makes the person even more entrenched into their position sometimes. I want to show you an example that Mr. Williams presented. He's a trial lawyer, as I mentioned, and there's a transcript I want to show you. I've highlighted a portion of the transcript where he asked the jury to side with him, and he gave the reason that he needed them to do so in order to protect commonly held values. Instead of making his closing argument about his position was correct and the other side was wrong, he asked the jury to validate and reward his client's courageous move to defend itself. Now, I'm going to set this up for you before I show you this transcript. So my client, my friend is a trial lawyer, and he's represented injured people, and he's represented big companies that have injured people. And in this situation, he was representing Exxon against someone who had been harmed by Exxon. And what he did was he employed the same human automatic action. His client could have avoided taking the stand altogether and just kind of been an empty chair for the jury. But instead what he did is he put his client, Exxon, on the stand. And in his closing argument, he said this. So this is James Williams, my buddy's testimony on the transcript. My client took the stand. He represents Exxon. She defended herself. She defended herself and her company against an onslaught, against getting caught up in a net and lumped together. And that took courage. But it's up to you, jurors, to make that mean something. If y'all check yes, oh yeah, there's proof of Exxon offshore, but it will mean nothing. That's what the highlighted point. He made an argument to the jury that maybe my client was wrong, but she was bold to even subject herself to scrutiny. And that takes courage. And my mama taught me about courage. And you see, he talks about Sam Simmons and the value that we teach our children about courage. And if y'all don't help my client out, that will mean nothing. And look at the jury form, ladies and gentlemen. You can't see it, but I'll read it to you. On the question, this is to the jury, do you find by preponderance of evidence that exposure to asbestos on the premises of Exxon was a substantial contributing factor to Mr. Hayden's contraction of mesothelioma and death? They checked no. And now we're in New Orleans, Louisiana. Not an Exxon-friendly place, a place that wants to help injured people if they can. But because he was able to employ the human automatic, he gave a reason why. Not that the other side was wrong, not that his client was right, but he gave him a reason, and on every single one of those charges, they found that Exxon was not liable for that person's damages. So when you're working on advocacy, strongly consider utilizing that weapon of influence that I just mentioned. So let's go to number 2. I want to talk to you now about the contrast principle. And this is an important principle too, before I get to the slide. The contrast principle is a psychological principle which provides that the difference between the way we perceive things is affected by whether we perceive it in isolation or whether we perceive it compared to something else. The principle was validated by researchers at Arizona State and Michigan State universities when they conducted studies regarding the principle, the perceived weight of an object. In group 1, the studies had someone lift a 20-pound item, and they asked the folks to give them their best guess as to what the weight of the item was. So group 1, pick up a 20-pound item, give us your best guess of what the weight is. Group 2, they had the participants first lift a 5-pound item, put it down, and then lift a 20-pound item, okay? Almost all of the people in group 2, the ones who had the 5-pound and the 20, perceived the 20-pound item to be heavier than in those in group 1. And the variance is explained by the contrast principle. In the study, the second group perceived the item to be much heavier than those who lifted the item without first trying to lift the lighter item. Let me give you an example of this. So my buddy is on the board of supervisors of LSU. He just became chairman of the board of supervisors. This is where I met him. And this is a letter that he received from parents of a student at LSU. It says, "Dear Mom and Dad, since I left for college, I have been remiss in writing, and I am sorry for my thoughtlessness in not having written before. I will bring you up to date now, but before you read on, please sit down. You're not to read any further unless you are sitting down, okay? Well then, I'm getting along pretty well now. The skull fracture and the concussion I got when I jumped out of the window of my dormitory when it caught on fire shortly after my arrival here is pretty well healed now." Now, my daughter just started at LSU. When I read this letter, I'm scared, right? "I only spent 2 weeks in the hospital, and now I can almost see normally and only get those sick headaches once a day. Fortunately, the fire in the dormitory and my jump was witnessed by an attendant at the gas station near the dorm, and he was the one who called the fire department and the ambulance. He also visited me in the hospital since I had nowhere to live because of the burned out dormitory. He was kind enough to invite me to share his apartment with him. It's really a basement room, but it's kind of cute. He's a very fine boy, and we have fallen deeply in love and are planning to get married. We haven't got the exact date yet, but it will be before my pregnancy begins to show. Yes, Mother and Father and Dad, I am pregnant. I know how much you are looking forward to being grandparents, and I know you will welcome the baby and give it the same love and devotion and tender care you gave me when I was a child. The reason for the delay in our marriage is that my boyfriend has a minor infection, which prevents us from passing our premarital blood test, and I carelessly caught it from him. Now that I have brought you up to date, I want to tell you that there was no dormitory fire. I did not have a concussion or a skull fracture. I was not in the hospital. I am not pregnant. I am not engaged. I am not infected, and there is no boyfriend. However, I am getting a D in American history and an F in chemistry, and I want you to see those marks in their proper perspective." It's effective, isn't it? That is the principle of the contrast, right? And so that is another effective tool that you can use when trying to convince a legislator, a city council person, a school board member, a city manager, anyone of an idea or of a position you have, that sometimes it's easy to show, not that you're right and that they're wrong, but compared to what could happen, this is a much better route for you to take. This is a much better avenue for you to take. And so, again, I want to show you a transcript from an actual trial that Mr. Williams participated in where he used the contrast factor to be successful. In this trial, his opponent had asked the jury, this is the same trial, the mesothelioma trial, the theliomia trial. The plaintiffs, the injured party lawyers, asked the jury for $18 million. Now, you got to remember, Mr. Williams is representing the defendant, Exxon. The claim is that the person contracted this disease, the sickness, while working on the premises of Exxon. So Mr. Williams wants that $18 million to be zero. The client, the injured party, the plaintiff, is asking for $18 million. So he has to decide, Do I argue that 18 million is too much? Do I argue that my client is right and that their client's wrong? And it's hard in New Orleans. You got to look, when you're a lawyer, you got to look at where you are, right? You got to look at the circumstances. In New Orleans, it's hard arguing that Exxon is right because people want to side with the injured victim traditionally in New Orleans. So what he did was he wanted to make the jury feel like the amount, the 18 million that they were asking for, was excessive. And so what he did, instead of arguing good or bad or right or wrong, he told the jury that juries usually award $100,000 in the cases. So he actually buttressed the plaintiffs. Yep, they do award money in these cases, but not 18 million, only 100,000. And that was designed to make the jury feel like the plaintiff's numbers were even more outrageous by contrasting the two. And this is the transcript. But just to give you a comparison to what I've seen in cases like this, the beginning line, $425,000 is what we've seen for stuff like this, for situations like this in these cases. So he was establishing a benchmark much lower than $18 million. And he kept saying, that's just based on what we've seen in cases like this. And as a result, the jury awarded much less. You saw the jury didn't award any money because they didn't find any fault in the previous thing. But that's how he was dealing with the damages thing. Again, this is for lawyers, but you got to take these advocacy tools and use them in your everyday life. Lawyers do it because we get paid to do it. Those of you who are civil rights engineers and social justice engineers, these same tools, these same principles you can use in your everyday life to convince people to support something or to oppose something. And so again, these are techniques that you can use, or as I call them, weapons of influence. So that is the contrast principle. All right, next, let's talk about commitment and consistency. This principle is also a weapon of influence, and this is a designation that describes psychological principles that override conscious decision making. The principle provides that human beings have an obsession, not a desire, an obsession to be consistent with what they have already done. Now think about that for a minute. Human beings have an obsession with being consistent with what they've already done. In other words, once we make a decision, ladies, you know this, once we make a decision, a choice, right? We take a stand, there are now internal psychological forces that are pressuring you to stay consistent. It's not just hard-headedness. Men, it's not just hard-headedness, there's science behind this, right? There's psychological forces. That's why it's so hard to change the way a person thinks by just making an argument. It's not just that they're being hard-headed necessarily. Sometimes it's psychology. You're competing against their psychology. The first study to uncover the power of this principle was conducted by psychologist Thomas Moriarty. Dr. Moriarty was a professor at NYU. So what he did was he staged a series of thefts on a beach. And he wanted to gauge whether bystanders would intervene to stop a theft, even if it meant bodily harm to them. All right? So in the first group, the accomplice, the research accomplice, put his blanket down 5 feet away from a bystander. And after several minutes passed, the accomplice left his stuff on the blanket. Okay? Shortly thereafter, a thief would come by, grab the accomplice's stuff, and run off, leaving the bystanders to witness the whole thing. They did it 20 times with 20 random bystanders. Only 4 of the 20 did anything. And all 4 of them, out of all 4 of them, none of them ran after the thief. The most you got out of the 4 was, hey, stop. That's not your stuff. They conducted the same study in the second group. And this time the research accomplice did the same thing. Put his blanket on the beach, put his personal items on the blanket, waited a couple of minutes, established ownership in front of the bystander, and left his stuff unattended in front of a bystander. This time the thief came and took the stuff and ran. But this time, before he left, he asked the bystander, hey, would you watch my stuff? You watch my things? This time when the thief came by and took it, 19 out of 20 bystanders attempted to stop the theft. 4-19. And get this, these 19 bystanders became virtual vigilantes. Each of the 19 bystanders actually left their own blanket and ran after the thief until they caught up with him. 10 of the 19 bystanders demanded an explanation. The other 9 bystanders either physically restrained the thief or snatched the stolen belongings back from the thief. The simple request to a human being, would you watch my stuff, changed it from don't care or hey, stop, to I got to protect this person's stuff. Because they had made a conscious decision in their head to be consistent. I am going to watch this person's stuff. And natural psychological forces pressured them into being consistent. I made a promise, this is what I'm supposed to do, and God dang it, I'm going to do it. This principle has been successfully deployed, for example, in political elections. As a former elected official, if I could get to someone first, before they had formed an opinion about me or about my opponent or about the race, and I asked them a simple question, will you vote? Will you vote for me on election day? And if I could get them to say yes, I promise you, ladies and gentlemen, you can't see everybody, but the ones you could see, if you had gotten them to make that commitment, if their response was yes, yes, you got my vote, 9 times out of 10, if they went to vote, you had that vote. People want to have a word. They want to be consistent. Psychologically, we as human beings are wired to want to have a commitment. So how do you put that in your everyday life? When you're talking to leaders, when you're trying to get someone to make a decision, if you can get them to commit, or to be part of it with you, be invested in it, chances are better that you can get them to stay consistent with that. You remember we talked about this before? Yes, I do. Congresswoman, and you told us then you were with us. And we know we can count on your vote because you told us then you were with us. Human psychology dictates that she will. The moral of the story regarding this principle is that you must get your target as early as possible before they form an opinion or take a position on the issue. That's the moral. Early, often, before they form an opinion. All right, social proof. This is one that we see a lot in this day and age, in our social media age. This psychological principle provides that we subconsciously determine what is correct by finding out what other people think. Black folks love cosigners, right? I mean, we like that. I give me a cosign. Whether it's right or wrong. If somebody else is with me, then it must be okay. Right? That's just cosigning. That's all it is, whether I'm right or wrong. If somebody says it's okay, then it's okay. James Williams, who's not here today, was my cosigner in college, Kyle. James is with me. My boy is with me. We must be right. No, you're wrong. Let me tell you what proves cosigning, and you guys are going to know exactly what I'm talking about. Television executives were the first people to understand this whole issue of cosigning. When the sitcom was invented, and television studios wanted to get people to be more involved in sitcoms and to sell more advertising, they had to figure out, how do you make sitcoms enjoyable? How do you get people to watch them? So what they learned was, if you put a studio live audience, and those of you who are a little bit older like me, you remember they'd say that at the end of the sitcom, taped in front of a studio live audience, and you had laughter, then when you studied that same show in someone's home in front of the television, when they heard the laughter, the people at television laughed harder, laughed longer, and even bad jokes were funnier if there was laughter after the joke. It was as if we had some type of instinctual co-signing. If somebody else thinks something's funny, chances are I may think it's funny too. The takeaway, as I've said, social proof laughter had a greater impact on persuading people to agree with a bad position. This is what I wanted. There was even some evidence to suggest that laughter provoked the greater reaction from the television audience to bad jokes. I mentioned that. So even a bad decision, if you can get a cosigner, a bad position, if you can get a cosigner, will still yield you better results than a neutral decision without one. That's what I wanted to tell you. So just consider that again as another weapon of influence. We see it in our world all the time. Susie Saavedra, our policy director, we're always being asked to co-sign on legislation or sign a letter with another group of people. And sometimes it seems like we're doing a lot of that. We're only doing that, right? Where people are asking us, hey, sign on this letter supporting something. Sign on this letter opposing something. And I've always wondered, does anybody even care about that? This psychological study says yes. That if you can co-sign, we've got co-signers, right? Co-signers on legislation, bipartisan support. Chances are if you can get more and more support, co-signers, even if it's not perfect, people will take it more seriously. All right, next principle. It's called reciprocation. This is a collection of principles that we've been discussing. This is another weapon of influence. This principle provides that we have an overpowering instinct to reciprocate someone's kindness. Think about that. We have an overpowering instinct to reciprocate someone's kindness. Professor Dennis Regan at Cornell University was the first person to research exploiting the principle of reciprocation as a tool to persuasion. And the Regan Cornell study put two people in a room under the guise of critiquing artwork. One person was secretly a research assistant, and the other was the subject. So there are two people in a room, they're looking at artwork. In some instances, the research assistant would leave the room and return with 2 bottles of Coca-Cola. The research assistant would offer the subject a Coke. Hey, I went to the refrigerator, they told me I could take 2, I brought you a can of Coke back as well. In other instances, the research assistant would simply return to the room empty-handed and continue to critique the paintings with the subject. An hour later, the research assistant asked the subjects if they would be willing to buy raffle tickets from them. Not surprisingly, Joe, the person who was the research assistant, sold more tickets to the folks for whom he brought a Coke. However, it is the overpowering effect of this principle that is noteworthy. There were also instances where the research assistant was rude and obnoxious to the subject during the critiquing processes. In situations where the research assistant did not bring a Coke to the subject, he sold more tickets to people he was nice to than he was rude to, right? That makes sense. Didn't bring a Coke, nice to the person, offered to sell tickets. If you were nice to the person, they might buy the tickets. But listen to this. However, in situations where the research assistant did bring a Coke to the subject and was then rude to the subject, he still sold more raffle tickets than when he was nice and didn't bring anything. Even being ugly to the person, but you gave him something, the human nature of reciprocation was, well, you did bring me a Coke. I guess I'll buy this damn ticket, right? Even when he was ugly. We are animals, right? We human beings. And some of these things are psychology. We try to explain them as personality. We try to explain them as compassion. We try to explain them as whatever they may be. But at the end of the day, this is an art. It's a science. And we in social services, we who help people, who work for people each and every day, we who have to go to Capitol Hill or our state capitol to convince men and women to do things for people. And we shouldn't have to all the time, but we do. It's part of what we do. I want you to strongly consider using some of these weapons of influence in doing it for good, right? It's superpowers. It's superpowers. Use them for good rather than for evil. Lawyers, good lobbyists, and we've got some in this room today, good governmental affairs people, good civil rights people, they use these items each and every day to do things. You can use them too. You can use them too. And so that's the first part of my presentation. I'm going to move into my second part, but this was the part that was going to be given to you, my friend. I hope I did it justice. I hope you were able to take some things away from it. So thank you. This is just a recap on those principles. And so I'm happy afterwards to try to talk to you about some of these issues, and if not, I'll put you in touch with Mr. Williams. Now, those of you who are here for CLE credit, see me after. Those of you who are lawyers who want to participate and to get the continuing legal education credit, see me afterwards, and I'll tell you how to get your CLE credit and who to talk to. So thank you for being here. All right. Now I want to talk to you about something I love and something I do, and I've got the pleasure of working with so many people on each and every day, and that's advocacy. So taking those same tools, taking those same techniques, and how do you use them on Capitol Hill? And I'm going to talk about Capitol Hill today, but you can use these same techniques at state capitals, at city council rooms. But this is just really how to talk to members of Congress, how to talk to elected officials, and how to do it on behalf of an organization. So all of you are part of something, a fraternity, a sorority, a social activist organization, the Urban League, NAN, NAACP, and you've been asked from time to time to go as a delegation and talk to people on the Hill. And if you've not, then I'm hoping this may help you do it better. I want to say These are techniques and tips that I have as a former Hill staffer, but a lot of these I've gotten from the men and women I work with, especially Miss Suzanne Bergeron, who was here in the back. She's been with the Urban League for over 30 years, and a lot of these are her even suggestions on how to make a difference on Capitol Hill. And then after I finish with this, I've got a special surprise for you. We will have Representative Donald McKeechin, who's a congressman, one of our new congressmen, who's going to be here with you, and we're going to sit down and talk with you with a real live congressman about some of these techniques, and we'll be able to ask him questions about what's the best way to talk to members of Congress, what's the best way to talk to, he's a former state legislator, and so you guys are going to have an opportunity to hear from the horse's mouth, like this is how to do it, this is not how to do it. But I'm going to give you my opinion on how to do some of these things. So Hill advocacy. Urban League affiliates, our partners, our community leaders, our guilders, our young professionals, all the men and women, and all of you who work in different organizations, we have an important stake in actively participating in the process that shapes policy at both the federal and state levels. And today when we have our panel later on this afternoon, our State of Black America panel, you're going to hear a lot of men and women talk to you about the importance of voting, the importance of public policy. I won't get into that right now, but I hope you guys understand that our participation in Congress, in the state legislatures, in the city councils, it's an obligation of us as social engineers to make differences. And so it's very important, and that's why the Urban League for over 100 years we've been engaged in it. And even though you have distance between your community, and even though it may seem far from where you live and your state capital, because of technology today, it's not hard to talk to people at your state capital because you can email them, you don't have to send mail anymore. The decisions that are made in these domes of power have direct implications on the quality of life of the men and the women that we serve each and every day. I just had lunch with State Senator Royce West from Dallas, Texas, and he and I, we just got so many points. We solved all the problems. Unfortunately, it was just the two of us. We solved all the problems, but that's the most frustrating thing. Is he says people walk up to him all the time and says, how's Washington? I don't know. I live in Dallas and I go to Austin, the state capital, to work. People think he's a United States senator. They don't even understand where he is. And so we have obligations to educate our people to make sure that when they are wanting to engage in advocacy, they're doing it. And advocacy is important because it builds relationships. We saw it today. We had a breakfast on Capitol Hill. The Urban League is one of the few organizations that I can proudly say we had Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell show up at our breakfast today. And it's because we build relationships. We don't have to always agree, and I said it when I introduced Leader McConnell. We don't always agree with you. But at least when we don't agree, we're able to come and have a dialogue with you. And unfortunately here in Washington, nobody wants to dialogue anymore. Everybody wants to take a side, dig in, and vilify the other side. That's fine if that's your organization's mission. That's not been the mission of the Urban League. And I would just humbly say to you, my opinion, I don't know that gets a whole lot done. May sell you some tickets to your gala, may get you some fundraising for certain groups. I just don't know that it reaches a whole lot of result when we live in a bipartisan society and members of Congress and members of your legislature, members of your city council are both Republican and Democrat. I don't know how that works, but maybe you'll teach me differently. But advocacy is about touching people, building relationships. It's important for our democracy. And as I like to say in the Urban League, our advocacy, what we're telling members of Congress, what we're telling elected officials, we really are, the Urban League, I look at our job. We are the thin line of protection for African Americans of communities of color. There are just not that many people who are fighting solely for what we fight for. I proudly wake up every day and I fight for African American people. That's not to say I don't care about other causes. But this cause is African American specific, and I'm very proud of that mission. That's what I do. Got a lot of friends who fight for Latino Americans. I got a lot of friends who fight for gay Americans. Got a lot of friends who fight for women. At the Urban League, we fight for African Americans. And so we at the Urban League believe our advocacy is that important. We also do it because we protect our voting, and a lot of our funding at the Urban League comes from the federal government, the programs that we're able to provide. And so for us, as many of you, understanding advocacy, knowing how to talk to people on Capitol Hill is important. So let's talk about what you need to do to get started. If you're going to go to the Capitol, you're going to go to any Capitol, any city council chamber, and you're going as a group, the first thing your organization needs to do, even before you go, is to designate a lead. And your lead doesn't need to be the president of the organization. Sometimes I'd actually say the lead shouldn't be the president of your organization. Advocacy should be something that is done by someone whose sole mission is advocacy. And I see Ms. Custis from the Philadelphia Urban League here had an advocacy person, just left, but you're going to replace. But your Urban League replaced already. Okay, found somebody. Our Philadelphia Urban League actually has a person who just does advocacy. right? So when we're able to talk to that person and that person's able to talk to us, we've got a conduit. And I can always talk to Ms. Custis about those things, but she's got a lot of things to do. She's running an entire urban league. Designate a lead. Find someone who can serve as your public policy point person and coordinator and can track legislation, can track issues that are important to you. And that person can also serve and act as a liaison between your organization and other organizations or other affiliates or other national organizations. So it's very important at the onset, have your advocacy person. We at the Urban League didn't have an advocacy person until last year. I'm practicing what I preach. Now on our staff, we've got 2 people who their jobs is advocacy. We've got a vice president of advocacy and we've got a director of advocacy who are here in this room. It's important. We always did advocacy, but we left it to people to just kind of do it on their own. We are in a time in our nation's history where advocacy just can't be willy-nilly. It just can't be done and let us know what you did. It's got to be intentional. And the best organizations who do it, it's intentional. It's not a coincidence that the NRA, the AARP, organizations like that, they're strong for a reason. If you ever wonder why are people siding with those people, because their advocacy is strong and intentional and strategic. And the Urban League and your organization should be that way too. So contacting a member, the first thing you want to do is you want to identify the members that represent you. That's a good place to start. If you don't know who your congressman is, that's not good to go to Capitol Hill and do a fly-in. If you don't know who your senator is, that's not good. You're 2 senators, you got 2. That's not good. Except in D.C., that's right. And so you want to know who those men and women are so that they fall into your organizational jurisdiction. Some of our urban leagues have 2 or 3 members of Congress who represent their district. You want to consider all those members of Congress your folks. In addition to identifying your congressional delegation, it is important to know. Now, these things are very important. You need to know the background of your member. Where does he and she come? Where did they come from? How did they get here? What drives them? Where did their kids go to school? Where did they go to college? All of those little things are things that you can use to build a relationship when you can walk into an office and say, how are your daughters doing? They're enjoying college? Members of Congress automatically know that their lives are public anyway. So they'll never ask you, well, how did you know that? I mean, they're on Facebook and Google and Twitter, and it's easy to find those things. The fact that you cared enough to even look will sometimes make a difference with their member. Their key issue of interest. I know you're an education champion. You've always been one since you were on the city council in Philadelphia. Now that you're in Congress, I bet you're working very, very hard to make education a national issue. You got them. You knew what I did in Philadelphia. You remember what I did when I was in city council? We elected officials love to be nostalgic. Remind me of my good old days. And the good old days are everything that happened before today. Cravens, I remember when you passed the bill that helped senior citizens who were lost, the Amber Alert bill, but it was the Gray Alert or whatever we'd call it. I remember you did. Man, that helped so many people, I bet, when their loved ones have Alzheimer's and they get lost. Or Cravens, you passed an autism bill. I know they helped a lot of. You remember that? Really? What can I do for you? Right? You want to know their voting records on issues of concern. If you can walk into a meeting and you can thank a member, I want to, first of all, Congresswoman, just thank you for your vote on the Affordable Care Act. I know it's under fight right now, but I want to thank you for the courage. I want to thank you for what you did, and I want to just, before we even get started, let you know we're committed, we're staying with you. Those are the things that are important to members of Congress. Committee assignments. How's the Small Business Committee going, Congressman? I know you sit on that committee as well. You know small business is a big issue for our organization as well. Those are important things to know. You want to know their district schedule. When are they in town? When are they in home? When are they in D.C.? That's important to know. Where their local district offices are located is important to know as well. Hey, Congressman, just have a seat. We'll be with you in a second. And then you want to know who are their key staff members who are handling your issues. Now, I want you guys to be clear on this. You want to know who their key staff members are, not just in Washington. Who is handling the issue back at home? You want to know Teresa back at home, and you want to know Johnny in Washington, because you want to know both of them. If you're going to be effective at what you do, you need to know the congressman, the congresswoman's staff who handles those issues, and you want to have those people on your speed dial and on a first-name basis. It's important knowing the congressman. And we'll interview a congressman in a little bit and talk to him and have a conversation with one. He can tell you himself. But I will tell you, as a former staffer for a United States Senator, and we're going to talk about staff. I'm going to wait. We're going to talk about staff in a second. This is it. Staff counts. I've had so many people tell me when they are insulted when they come to Washington and the member can't see them, and they had to meet with staff. And I look at those people and say, you're doing it wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, the people who make the decisions behind the scenes, in large part, that's not to say our members aren't educated, but who you think is helping that member be educated? That member has 10 meetings a day at least. They've got votes in between. They got to go speak. If it's CBC Week or Black History Month, they're all over the place. I was busy during Black History Month when I was in the legislature. Right? They have all those things to do. They got family issues they got to deal with. And if you think they can keep track of every single issue without a staff, then you're doing it wrong. The chief of staff, the legislative director, the most important person, the scheduler. If you ignore those people, you're rude to those people, you don't take those people serious, and you don't form a relationship with those people, you are doing it wrong. They are critical. And you need to know the staff both locally that handles your issue and the staff in Washington, D.C. Some tips. Do face-to-face visits with the staff. Come to Washington sometimes, not necessarily to see the congressman, but to see his legislative director. If it's a good staffer and the congressman's available, they'll pull the congressman in. They'll say, hey, the congressman's around. That's a good meeting. That's when you're winning. When you didn't even ask to see the congressman, you wanted to see the staffer, but the staffer went out of his or her way to pull the congressman in. That's the relationship you're shooting for. You want to invite them to visit you. Amy Sanchez, where's Amy? Right here. Amy was a staffer with me on Capitol Hill. We love to take trips back home. We love to take trips back home. Invite me as a staffer to come to see your urban league, to come to see your chapter, to come to your fraternity meeting back at home. That's a good excuse to take a trip, go back to the district, have a little fun maybe, let your hair down, just get away from Washington. Believe it or not, sometimes you just want to get away from Washington. Right? Invite us to come. We will come. And the congressman loves it because I'm sending my staff down to my constituents, and they'll set up other meetings while they're there too. Invite staff to come visit you. It's not an insult that the congressman doesn't have time to see you. You're getting 2 for the price of 1 with the staffer. You're getting the congressman and you're forming a new relationship. And these young men and these young women who are staffers are the congressmen tomorrow, are the cabinet secretaries of tomorrow, are the presidents of tomorrow, are the governors of tomorrow. You're building relationships. Congressional relationships, ladies and gentlemen, are much more important than a relationship with any president. President Barack Obama is surfing and doing other things. He's out, right? He did his 8 years. We've got a new president. Nancy Pelosi's been in Congress for a long time. Chuck Schumer's been in Congress for a long time. Your relationship, Mitch McConnell has been in Congress for a long time. Your relationships with members of Congress, I always say presidents come and go. Members of Congress, they last forever. Your relationship, and we as African Americans have taken that for granted. We've gotten so caught up in MSNBC and CNN and Fox and all these places talking about the presidential elections. We've been sleeping on these congressional elections and sleeping on congressional advocacy. And we've lost so many midterm elections to people who don't care about our issues because we didn't go out and vote because President Obama wasn't on the ballot. And yet after they lost majority, it was hard for President Obama to get anything done because people didn't vote during midterm elections, right? We have got to go back to our neighborhoods and our communities and our hamlets and educate people on these midterm elections because they're important. So let me get back. Last thing, thank the staff for when they help you. Send them a thank you note. Send them a thank you email. I just want to thank you for your time and helping me. I know we didn't get to spend time with the Congresswoman this time, but I appreciate it. 3 tips. Take a picture of this one. 3 tips for getting in the head of a staffer. Birthday notes. Know when Amy Sanchez's birthday is, so when you want to talk, you want to send her something that has nothing to do with small business, because Amy was on a small business committee. She ran our entrepreneurial part of small business. You want to make sure she knows what your organization is doing? Send Amy a birthday note. It doesn't have to be about small business, anything. Amy, happy birthday. Appreciate what you do. Amy won't forget that. Constituent recognition letters. Amy, I know your boss represents the great state of Louisiana. We had a member recently who was nominated and awarded top 40 under 40. I know Senator Landrieu would love to send a letter of recognition to this young woman for being top 40 under 40. Here is the letter. Have Senator send that to her. I know that young woman would appreciate it and the senator would appreciate it. You have just made Amy a superstar. Senator Landrieu, so-and-so was just nominated top 40 under 40 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She's also a member of the Urban League of Louisiana. Can we just send her a thank you note? The senator doesn't even have to know about it. Amy can get that done. You have made a constituent happy. You have become a resource to that staffer. Craven sends me stuff to help me look better to my boss and to help my boss look better to constituents. I know that's simple. You maybe don't think about it. Trust me, ladies and gentlemen, it's helpful. Lastly, thank you letters. If your organization supports legislation that passes or opposes legislation that fails, send a thank you message to the staffer as well. Not just to the senator, send it to the staffer or to the congressman, or send it to the staffer and ask them to relay it to the congressman. Please don't sleep on these tips. I can't under or overstate how important it is to talk to members of the staff. All right, walking into the door. You're there to see Congressman Keechan. You want to walk into the door, how do you do it? The first thing you do is you send an email or a letter to the scheduler. The scheduler is the most important person in that office. If that person doesn't like you, you won't get a meeting. And you damn sure won't get a meeting with a congressman ever. And that's the truth. Form a relationship with that young, typically young woman, because women are the only people who can manage and handle the stress of being a scheduler. We men are too weak to do it most times. Send an email, send a letter. An email is what you want to send. I'm going to talk about sending mail to the Capitol. Don't send mail to the Capitol. It gets scanned and it never makes it. Send an email, and then you want to follow up with a phone call in 10 days or so. Now, my millennials in here, do you all know what this is? Does anybody know what this is? It's a telephone. This is the first telephone. I want to talk to you about what a telephone is, millennials. Telephones actually dial out. You can actually call somebody on the other side. You don't have to just text them. Pick up the phone and call a member's office after you send the email. Follow up with a phone call. The scheduler still answers a phone. And so if you don't get a response to your email within 10 days or so, pick up the phone and call the young person and say, I sent you an email. I know you guys are very, very busy. We're trying to get a meeting with Congressman McKeechan. Can you please help us find a time? Before you walk into the office, get your mind right. What are we here for? What's the purpose of this? Is this our first meeting with Congressman McKeechan, or is this our second meeting? Did we talk to him when he was in the legislature, or is this our first time? Understand why you're there. Identify the purpose of your visit. And that's how you're going to lead your meeting with him. Congressman McKeechan, so glad to be here. Thank you for your time. Let me tell you why we're here today and who is in the room with us. You're going to select your delegation. Everyone in the delegation should be part of planning the meeting. You want to identify the speakers. Now listen to this, brothers and sisters. You want to identify the speakers, not who's the most important person, not who's got the highest title, but who's maybe got the best relationship, right? That's something we're learning at the Urban League. It's about relationships, and sometimes it may be the most junior person at your affiliate who has the relationship. It may be your young professional who is a CEO of a company in their own right who has the relationship with Congressman McKeechan because maybe they went to school with one of his children or his brother or his sister. It's not about who's the most important. It's about who's got the relationship. Or if it's a complex issue or an issue that someone has an expertise in, maybe it's that person who's going to do most of the talking. We're here to talk to you about a tech and telecom issue, Congressman. We brought our good friend Donna Epps to talk to you about it because this is what she does for a living and she understands it better than any of us. So we let Donna do the talking. And we'll come back later and I'll tell you a little bit about what the Urban League is doing. To that, you want to be prompt, be patient. Suzanne wrote this part. Suzanne, I could not have said this any better. The legislative process does not lend itself to a timely schedule. And it just doesn't. Don't be offended that you show up for a meeting and the congresswoman, they're running late. That's how it works. When you book a flight into Washington, don't book it on a schedule. Have a flexible flight schedule because it just may not work the way you wanted it to work. Council members, state legislators, a little bit different, but here in Congress, you never know when a vote's going to be called. Begin by allowing each member of the delegation to introduce themselves and briefly state the purpose of the visit. We talked about that. All right, assume you have 15 minutes, but don't rush. Sounds like something I learned in the Army, right? Assume you got 15 minutes, but don't rush. Hurry up and wait. The way you want to do this, I know you're familiar, so for instance, the National Bar Association. I know you're familiar with the National Bar Association, but I just want to give you an overview of the organization both nationally and locally. You always want to start by telling the member, reminding them who you are, what's important, Who do you represent? We represent 88 affiliates at the National Urban League across 36 states, including the District of Columbia. We've got young professionals here today. We've got guild members. They're going to introduce themselves, but this is who we are today. If you're going to talk about legislation, know the bill number. That's embarrassing, huh? We're here to talk to you about the such and such bill. All right, what bill is that? Because that's how members think, and that's definitely how their staffers think. Oh, I don't have the bill number. It's the sex trafficking bill. What's the bill? That's not good. You're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. Have your stuff together, right? Have your stuff together. Discuss how the member can be helpful. This goes back to our tools of influence. Discuss how the member can be helpful to his or her constituents by supporting or opposing the legislation. Make it psychology. Make it where it's almost subconscious to them. Get them to commit if you can. Tell them how this will hurt someone if they support this legislation or if they oppose this legislation. That's what you're there to do. You're there to persuade, or at least make your position known, and hope that you can persuade. Be informed. Do your homework. Prepare for possible questions. Another embarrassment. Congressman asks you a question. Well, what would you say? I've heard some people say blah, blah, blah about the bill. What do you say to that? And you don't have an answer? You're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. Be prepared. Role play before you get there. Now, what if he asked me this? Congressman Keachin's a smart man. He might come back with this. And if you've studied his background and you know his voting record, like I suggested earlier, you might be able to foresee some questions he had. You know, when I was in the state legislature, this issue came up and I voted the other way. Now, why should I change now? You need to know those things. That's how you build a relationship. Prepare information to leave behind with your member, and I'll show you what we've been leaving behind at the Urban League. We're getting better. We're getting better. Successful Hill meetings are 90% about the relationship you're creating, the way you empower the staffer, the degree to which they trust your perspective, and how you say what you are saying. 90% of the meetings are about the relationship, the way you empower the staffer, the degree to which they trust your perspective. You want the staffer to know, when Kyle Williams comes here, his stuff is always tight. So I'm okay with him meeting with the congressman, with or without me, because I know he's an honest person. And even if we don't agree with him at times, he's not going to try to hijack my boss. Staffers are there to protect their bosses, empower them, and create a sense of trust with them that you would never do anything to embarrass them with their boss. Members of Congress have hundreds of meetings, receive millions of letters and emails each year, mostly about policy issues or position statements on behalf of groups and individuals. So make your meeting count. And that's the same for a city councilman. That's the same thing for a state legislator, a school board member. Make your meeting count. All right. After the meeting, and I'm going to wrap up. After the meeting, remember, you're meeting on the Hill, and it takes a lot of work. It's just one meeting. It's not done, right? It's not drop the mic. Well, we met with McKeachin. We got it. We did it. It's just one touch. Good advocacy organizations are in constant touch with their members of Congress. What I suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, is the same thing I suggested to the Urban League. You should talk to your members of Congress at least twice a year. You should come to our Legislative Policy Conference in May. It's going to be May 1st of 2018, where we go to the Hill and we talk to our members of Congress. And then during August recess, when they go home for recess, it's not home for vacation. It's home for recess, right? The August recess for members of Congress was designed so in the old days when people couldn't fly back and forth, they could at least have enough time to go home at some point during the year. Utilize August recess as an opportunity to get members to come to you, to invite them. So plan a meeting in August. That's what I'm saying. Plan a meeting in August. Plan a lunch in August. Plan a breakfast in August. And that be your annual legislative breakfast, or your annual city council legislative breakfast, where you can have your council members and your congressmen. Plan it in August, because they're home in August. They ain't got many excuses not to come to your deal in August. During the year, they can say, I'm in Washington. An effective advocacy organization will correspond with congressional members and staff on a routine basis about legislation, but will also remain in steady contact regardless of whether an immediate crisis is issued. Please don't just call Congressman McKeachin when you need something. That's too late. You're doing it wrong. If you've built an effective relationship, you can call them when you need something, or when there's a hot issue. Please oppose the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. But that shouldn't be the first time you contact your member. Shouldn't be the first time you contact your city council when something is broken. You should have a relationship. Let the member or the staff know that you expect another touch or meeting in August during recess. And then finally, you need feedback. So if your organization is going to do advocacy effectively, ladies and gentlemen, you have to get people, when they meet, they come back and tell you what happened at the meeting. Because otherwise, you can't gauge if you're being successful or not. And in an organization like the Urban League, what's very, very important is that if Ms. Custis is in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, and she meets with Senator Casey, wouldn't it make sense that when I see Senator Casey on Capitol Hill, and all he's seen is this Urban League pin, that we're kind of keeping the same conversations going? I heard you met with Andrea in Philadelphia recently. I know she talked to you about our Main Street Marshall Plan, Senator. I want to talk to you about it too. We did not have that technology at the Urban League. We had to hope that the CEO would just shoot us an email if it happened. Now, we've been able to build that technology so that when Ms. Custis meets with her senator, I now have access, and when I meet with her senator, she now has access to my notes, and now it's a constant dialogue. And that's what we are trying to build at the Urban League, and that's what I suggest you build at your organization too. Feedback and communication is key. So to wrap it up, the do's: contact your member at least 2 times a year. Form relationships with local and DC staff. Email and call, phone call, offices. Be inclusive with advocacy, not exclusive. Just because you have the relationship don't mean you get to hoard the relationship. Share your relationship with your member of Congress. Introduce your young professionals to your relationship so that the relationship can continue going. And doggone it, realize you don't know every damn thing about advocacy. There's so many people who tell me every day, I don't need to come to this. These seats should be full. I have to look at this every time I can. Advocacy is a routine. You lose it because we don't do it every day, unless you're a lobbyist. And there are a few lobbyists here, but those of us who don't do it every day, if you don't practice it, you lose it. It's like golf. If you just don't do it every day, you just will never get good at it. So many people tell me, oh, I know so-and-so. I don't need to come to the advocacy training. I know Congressman McKeeshan. It's an art. It's a science. It's a technique. The don'ts. Don't wait for an issue to pop off before you make contact. Don't ignore staff, even junior staff. Junior staff will be senior staff if you give them a little time. Don't ignore them. Don't mail letters to DC offices. I talked to you about that. Letters are scanned into a system because of security in Washington, DC, in the Capitol. And so your letter, when I get it, when Congressman McKeeshan gets your letter, it's like this. So don't mail letters. People always ask me that question. Shoot an email. It's okay to shoot an email to a member of Congress. I know it doesn't feel like it's this, I'd like to get a handwritten note, because they're not going to get it. And when he does get it, it'll be scanned and destroyed. So for members of Congress, shoot an email, don't mail letters. Keep your relationship with your members. Don't keep your relationship from your members of your organization. Share them. And don't think you know every damn thing about advocacy. This is the card we left behind at the Urban League this year. And so I will tell you, although that has a lot of wording on it, and we are getting to a place where it will be a better leave behind, we have made substantial progress. Our boss likes to be thorough.
Verbose. I didn't say that. I didn't say that.
And so we have been pushing him as a staff to be as concise as possible. But this was the leave behind we left this year. And so my team, who's been here before me, predates me, will tell you this is pretty good for the Urban League. But what it did was it talked about the major parts of things that we were. So we had a new Congress this year, a new president this year. The Urban League was concerned with one thing and one thing only this year when it came to our legislative thing, was to make sure we didn't lose the things that were important to the Urban League. We had made so much progress over the last 8 years, especially with funding. Programs we put on every day at our small business centers, at our housing centers, at our reentry centers, at our senior citizen centers, that we didn't want a new president or a new Congress to say, oh, that's just giveaway programs. We can cut that stuff. So if you look at what we did, we were very thorough in showing the amount of money that we were fighting for the adult employment and training and the youth and those things. So that's what, and so we talked about that in jobs and workforce, education and mentoring. On the back of it, we talked about housing and community development and health. Those are the 4 areas the Urban League has always worked on. But we wanted members of Congress, new members of Congress, old members of Congress, new president. We wanted them all to know the things that were important to the Urban League and what we do. And so that was our leave behind. We also included contact information. You see my information and Susie. So when you're looking at a card to leave behind, try to be more succinct than this if you can be. but this is what we did at our policy conference. This is the leave behind we left. So I just want you guys to see a copy of what a leave behind looks like. You want to put time and effort talking about who you are, about your organization, in your leave behind. Questions? Yes, sir.
Don, I wanted to, when I was a staffer, one of the things that was kind of hit me, I was so used to getting chewed out because someone in the district complained about something that most of the time was a lie. But whenever there was a constituent or someone visited that actually made a point to say something good and it came back to me, I always spent some time. So now with my clients, one of the strategies I tell them is identify a staffer and just, before you get it, hey, you know what, Don really treated me well, and there's nothing in the world.
Nothing better. I agree. Nothing that you're right. Because think about the Congress we're working in, or the political environment. All politicians and staff are working in this day, on every level of government. It's a lot of bad, a lot of negative. People hear a lot of negative. And so whenever you can get a positive, just a little affirmation, goes back to those techniques we talked about at the very beginning, right? You can give me, we have an obligation, if you do something nice for me. Those of you who walked in late, you missed some good techniques. Weapons of influence, I call them. If you do something nice for me, chances are what? I'm gonna try to reciprocate that. Even if you're ugly to me after you do something nice for me. I owe him because he said something nice to my boss about me. It's a good point. Yes, sir.
You mentioned these techniques which make you look good in your organization to your boss. The congressman comes to your dinner, your breakfast, or your event. But Congressman Meacham is a new member.
Right.
The Congressional Black Caucus is a minority of the Democratic Party, of the Democratic Caucus, which is a minority and has no Jews, can't even call it hearing. That's not true.
We're going those issues. I'm gonna let the congressman. What I'd say is those are good questions, and I want you to ask them.
What my question is, what is the good if you have to go through 50 members of the Congressional Black Caucus who can't change the mind of the Democratic Caucus, which can't prevail against the House of Representatives, let alone the Senate, let alone the President?
Great question.
You're going one person at a time, and it's like you.
Great question. What I'd ask you is, I want you to ask that question again in our next segment, because we're going to have the congressman up here, and I want you to ask him, because that's a very important question. And those of you who are saying, well, I mean, that doesn't make any sense. Ladies and gentlemen, many people in our community today are asking that same question. How can you be effective if you're in a minority party, or how, I had a question asked recently, if I'm an African American and I live in a deeply red state, why even care if I know my vote won't count? People are asking those questions. I want to get the congressman to address in the next session. So hold your question. I'm going to answer questions right now just about what I presented about the weapons of influence and about how to do these meetings. And then we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then I need you to come back because I got Congressman McEachin here, and as you can already tell, we're going to have some serious questions. But we're going to answer those questions, and I want you to pose those tough questions. We have an obligation today to ask some of those tough questions, and I brought you someone who can definitely answer them. So great question. Just hold it for me, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Martin Griffin. I used to work on the Hill a few years ago and do government affairs, and I appreciate how you talked about like Hill meetings. But what is your recommendation for organizations to engage with members of the organization who maybe can't attend DC, whether it's via using technology? How should organizations mobilize those who aren't able to help elevate their influence?
You send who you can to Washington. If it's 2 people, it's 2 people. You wait till August recess, and you grab them at home. Those meetings at home are very vital, and I don't know that we as African Americans take a lot of advantage of meetings at home. When I was a chief of staff for a woman who would absolutely want to meet with her African American constituencies, Louisiana is 30% African American, Mary Landrieu counted on the African American vote every election. I can count on one hand how many African American constituencies called us. Now, we would make sure we would go to the communities to make sure we were seen, but I don't recall fraternities, I don't call sororities saying, hey, Senator, when you're home for August recess, come see us. We've got our legislative breakfast. I'm asking you to change that. I'm asking you to consider doing that at home. It doesn't have to be expensive to be an advocate. I think your organization can, if they can send folks, and if they couldn't come to Washington ever, you still get them at home. That's why it's important to know that district schedule, know those district staffers. You could never come to Washington. You could never see the congressman. You can still meet with Congressman McEachin's staff at home. So that's how you do it. Smart, just smartly, just very creative. Good question. Yes, ma'am. Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. You got the mic.
Yeah, my name is Perry Paler.
Hey, Brother Perry.
I'm an attorney here in Silver Spring, Maryland. I'm also a member of a Black Greek organization, and the different organizations have days on Congress.
Yes.
And I was wondering, have you seen some of the advocacy techniques
Yes.
used when they have mass attendance?
Yes.
And do you see a benefit to those days when they
Absolutely do.
visit
Great
Congress?
question. I won't ask you which fraternity you're in just in case you're in the wrong one, and then I won't ask you the question. Is he one of your fraternity brothers?
I don't know.
If he's an alpha, he's all right.
I'm from the Kappa Alpha side.
Well, then that's worse. No, great question. Great question.
Which is the largest caucus on the
Great question. The Deltas do it better than anybody I've ever seen. And they did it better even at the legislature in Louisiana, and the Alphas had a day, and the Kappas would come. I will tell you what I have seen, and Congressman, you obviously when you come back up, the Deltas do it. And the Deltas do their day on the Hill. Jack and Jill was here last weekend. They had their congressional, their legislative workshop. I spoke to them as well. Those things do matter. And it is important to see that Sea of Red, the National Bar Association was here early in the year. What we could be doing better, though, is the feedback. So I'll give you an example today. The Congressional Black Caucus, we come here every year. And our best and brightest come here, and you guys have a wonderful, wonderful workshop. And you come here and you meet people, and we have great parties. How many of y'all have been to Capitol Hill since you've been here? How many of you are planning to go meet with your member, not just your black member, but your white senator while you're here? How many of you? How many of you going to meet with staff while you're here? Why come to a legislative conference if our best and brightest African Americans from the country aren't going to go to Capitol Hill and say, I just wanted to stop by and say, hi, I'm here for the CBC. That's where we could be doing better as organizations. Our organizations do flood the Hill, and they've got their colors on. We all do it, all our fraternities and sororities. I just don't know how impactful, I don't know what our policies are when we go and do it. We're there, we're visible, and that's important. But are we being strategic in it? And the congressman can give you his opinion about that too. So I think we could be more strategic. One of the things I was meeting with Senator Royce West from the great state of Texas. He's Omega, and we were just talking about this. We as black organizations need a summit. We got to convene, and we got to get together. We got to figure out a better way to do what we're doing. We're all doing it in silos. It's 2017. We shouldn't be doing it in silos. Never was ever an opportunity for us to get together. And that's what we hope they do. Yeah. Well, that's another panel for another time. Yes, ma'am.
First, I want to thank you so much for your presentation, comments, and suggestions. My name is Rochelle Black, and I'm in charge of government relations at Oakland University, which is 30 miles north of Detroit.
Okay.
My question is, I try to get here as frequently as possible,
Yes.
but we don't have a firm, we don't have staff, but we have a lot of activity. And I can say for certain, in the 22 years I've been doing what I'm doing, the first 6 months we were bombarded for this sign-in, this issue, so many things. There are the high-profile issues that come up, but there are also those that are not. What do you suggest for those who have a lot of activity going on, but they just simply do not have the staff or
So
consultant
an
or a
organization
firm?
that might have an executive director but doesn't have the whole staff? Great question. The dawn of technology has made that person's job, though, a little easier in that when it was about mailing letters and postage stamps and having to do, now with the advent of the technology that we've got now, one person can be a powerful force, or one person with some volunteer help can be a powerful force. And so I would just say to you, don't ever underestimate. I tried, if you notice on any of the slides, nothing I proposed was $1 million proposal. None of my slides said bring your budget, right? It was things I think you can do. I think you can send a birthday email. You can make a call. You can see the person when they're in the district if you can't fly to Washington. So I tried to present to you in that, and I'm happy to talk to you further about it offline. I think you can do it on the cheap and still be very, very effective. Thankfully, the days of having to have a bunch of people on the phone and a bunch of people doing stamps and a bunch of people running off copies, I made the comment yesterday to my staff. I said Kinko's. And then I heard my staff talking about I must be old school if you say Kinko's because now it's FedEx. But you don't have to go to Kinko's anymore. You don't have to go to Kinko's anymore, right? You can do a lot of those things by email. They don't think I'm listening sometimes. I hear. I'm old, but I can still hear. One more question, and then we're going to take a break, and then, okay, we got one. This young lady has a question.
A lot of ideas, and and you want
You're an
things done,
individual.
you've got ideas for legislation. Who writes the legislation? If I come as an individual and say, I think this legislation should be, the staffer.
Staff?
I come and talk to staff, are they gonna listen to me? It's just me.
Yep.
All right, that's
Now, real quick, she actually.
It's a great question.
She said, one of the things I was gonna say that, so I'm a member of a lot of organizations. One of them is AMAC, Advisory Council.
Yep.
We have other entities who are small, just like the sister suggested, National Association of Women in Construction. And what happens is, and I didn't think about it just now, just to get to the point, they have kind of jacked our legislative debt. So we become one, their issues are similar.
Right.
But we combine, and that's a way, kind of to, because the similar issues, as long as they're not trying to take over, which is not the case in this particular.
True.
That's something that a group of different individuals already can come and just combine forces to reach a similar thing.
So two things, as an individual, a staff member is never not going to respond to you because when I say never, obviously there's an example, but there's a staffer behind you who I've seen her matriculate from being a staffer on the Hill to now doing great things for a national company, and there are other staffers in here, and they can tell you, we're not going to ignore you. I don't say, oh, her organization is 100 people, this woman's organization is 1,000, I'm not going to call this woman back. We hear from constituents all the time. You got to make your voice heard, and you stay consistent, right? So I don't want anyone in this room to think you got to be part of an organization to be effective. You do not have to be. It's about relationships. It's about relationships, and then I'll finish with the organization thing. I agree. We've been fighting this repeal of Obamacare at the Urban League, and it dawned on us a couple of months ago as we were doing action alert after action alert, why can't we share our action alerts with other African American or any organization that's on our side of these organizations? And so we signed an MOU with the Boulay, because the Boulay said, we don't have a full-time person who does this stuff. Why doesn't the Urban League start sharing some of those higher issue action alerts? We don't want y'all to take over our organization, and we don't want to. But if we're going to be on the same side of some of these things, and so what we want to do in the fall and in the spring, and that's why I was talking about this convening, I'm just starting to push my idea, is I want to see us as an African-American people consider having a convening on voting. But as part of that, a big part of that be advocacy. And can we agree, can we put our egos, check them at the door, and say on certain issues, if the Urban League is writing a policy paper on why Affordable Care Act is good for our people and why if we repeal it, it's going to kick off a bunch of African-American people, why can't we share that with the Deltas and say, Deltas, put this out too. Put this, and you can put your logo on it. We just want the information out. We have not been doing a great job, and I take responsibility for that. I can't point the finger at anybody because Mark Boreal hired me to come do that. I hear it, and we're going to do a better job of it. We're going to do a better job of it. That's my plan for next year. That's my plan for next year. So with that, let's take a 5-minute break, and we're going to bring the congressman up. Thank you. And to his state, and he's been very patiently waiting while we were talking about all these things that he's going to be able to tell us a lot more about. But from an early age, Representative Donald McEachin learned the value of hard work and service to his fellow man. His father was an Army veteran, and his mother a school teacher. They taught him the importance of community and looking out for those who needed most. Prior to being elected to Congress, he served as a legislator in Virginia's General Assembly for much of the last 20 years, first in the House of Delegates, then in the State Senate. So he brings a wealth of experience at all levels of government. His career has been dedicated to protecting the most vulnerable citizens and defending the rights of all Virginians. On the issues of equality, gun violence prevention, protecting the environment, and advocating for each military service members and their families, Congressman McEachin has been an unwavering champion. And he's been just a very, very dear friend of the Urban League. And so I'm very happy to have you. Let's give a round of applause to Congressman Donald McEachin.
Thank you.
Congressman, you got a chance to see a little bit about what we've been talking about today. This session has been about advocacy, and we talked about advocacy as an art form, and then we talked about it on how to really do it. And so I want to get your thoughts on that. But before we do that, I just want to welcome you and thank you again for being supportive of the Urban League. And maybe, I know I gave a brief bio, but if you want to just share a little bit more about yourself to the audience, please do.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you to the Urban League for putting this on. Advocacy is one of the things that I most like to have an opportunity to come and chat about, because I think so often people think that only money buys you influence, only money buys you access, and when that is very much not the truth. And so I'm happy to be here and share some thoughts with you on that. Just a little bit more about me. I went to American University right here in Washington. I went to UVA for law school, where I met my wife. We've been married 29 years. She is a prosecutor, and let me tell you, a prosecutor is exactly who you want raising your children. There are no shades of gray. Everything is black and white, and there are consequences for your actions. So that is in large part why our 3 children, who all basically have recently finished school, all have jobs, all finished school, all have jobs. And then in 2005 to 2008, I went and got my most challenging degree from an HBCU, Virginia Union University, the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology. So I have an MDiv as well, and that was a wonderful and marvelous experience. So I look forward to sharing with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. So I want to talk to you a little bit about, you've served in the legislature for over 20 years?
Yeah, well, yeah, sure.
20 years, and you got a chance to now come to Congress. What are the differences? Tell us about some of the differences between serving in a state legislature and then a federal legislature.
So a couple of the major differences are, one, in the state legislature, you're part-time, and so you're paid part-time, and so you have to have a second job. I was a trial lawyer, and so you're a legislator, and it's important for those folks who are talking to these part-time legislators to understand that they're balancing 2 lives. They have their responsibilities to whatever pays their bills, and then they have their responsibility to what my wife would call my expensive habit, which is being an elected official. So that's a challenge. That's a challenge. The other major difference is that most state legislatures have to finish in a finite time period. You know, in Virginia, we were 60 days in even years, 46 days in odd years. The difference being is that we did the budget in even years, so that accounts for the difference in days. The Congress, there is a myth out there that the Congress moves slowly. The Congress might move slowly on some things, but you know what? We vote 4 times a day at least on all sorts of issues, and so I have come to understand that is quite the myth. That we may not have a finite deadline or time period by which we absolutely leave for a long period of time like you do in the state legislature, but I think we work just as hard as the state legislators do. And I will tell you also that I am so honored to be in the House of Representatives. It is the best job in the world. I do not know what people have to complain about, because you know what? I now have one job. I don't have to worry about overhead, and all I have to do is worry about getting reelected. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Congressman, you've seen successful advocacy at both stages. Talk to us a little bit about how do you define a successful advocacy program? Or if the Kappas were coming to Capitol Hill, if they were asking you, hey, Frat, what's successful advocacy? What would you tell them?
Well, let me, if I can I back it up a little bit?
Sure.
Because I think it's important that you all understand that successful advocacy understands that everything that we do in the legislature to a large extent is based on relationships. And you heard that said in the last segment. And it gets to be very personal. You know, there's nothing more personal than walking around in the summer heat trying to get names in your petition so that you can get on a ballot. There's nothing more personal than going door to door trying to get yourself elected. There's nothing more personal than being the target of an attack ad. And there's nothing more personal than being declared the winner on election night. And those people who make that journey with you, who walk with you, who talk with you, they can go through what I like to call that crucible experience with you. Those are the people who can be very successful, because they may not have given you a dime, but they gave you a whole lot of their time. They know how many children you have. They know their birthdays. They know your birthday. They know that I like Star Trek, all forms of Star Trek they know. Because why do they know this? Because we talk between doors. We talk, while we're getting signatures. And so what I would suggest to you is that successful advocacy begins during the election cycle. Now, obviously, you can't always pick the winner, and a lot of the things that you learned in the last segment are helpful if you don't have that type of relationship with the congressman or congresswoman that helped get them there. But you ought to try to get that relationship, because that is the key to the kingdom. Those are the people who get their phone calls returned. Those are the people who actually make you change your mind about things. And I'll give you, if I can just take another minute.
Please.
I'll give you an example. Most people in Virginia and people here in D.C. are starting to understand that I think the environment is the issue for the 21st century. I think it is, we've got to get it right. I think it's a job issue. I think it's a moral issue. It's a core value to me. But believe it or not, as late as 2006 probably, I was agnostic as to the environment. And then there was an election in 2007. If you can believe this or not, I was in a majority African American district. My state senator who's Democrat, senior state senator, decided to endorse George Allen over Jim Webb. He decided to endorse George Allen, a Republican, over Jim Webb, a Democrat. He stood at a pumpkin patch with George Allen and George Bush holding a pumpkin to emphasize his support for George Allen. Needless to say, that became a flyer the next year when I primaried him. But this is what happened. There was a woman who did all those things with me. She walked with me. She, took me through her neighborhood. She introduced me to everybody that she could. And all the while, she's all up in my ear about the environment. And all of a sudden it's like, wow, because she cares and I was agnostic, I started to care. And then, she would tell me some things, and, I have to be faithful to my institution, Junior Union. At the same time, I'm going through seminary, we're starting to talk about creation care. So, obviously the Holy Spirit was up to something, but I had that person in my ear who was working with me and who was just talking to me about what she cared for. And now, I say it with a little bit of reluctance, because I'm not that great at tooting my own horn, but now at least in Virginia, I'm viewed as an environmental champion. Well, that started with somebody who was just working with an election cycle with me. And so it can make a difference. And so I would suggest to you that that's how, again, I know you all can't replicate that experience because you might pick the wrong candidate, but I can't say enough about getting into a personal relationship with a candidate and an elected office holder.
Congressman, I want to talk to you a little bit about staff, because I made a big point about how important it is for advocates or constituents to form relationships. You have a young man I see in the back who's probably letting people know where you are and what time you're getting back. How important is it that we form relationships with your staff?
Absolutely, it's critically important. That is Cody McClellan in the back. He is my LD. My district director is out in the hallway, Alden Burton. Especially in our office, what you should know is that Cody wrote every position paper I wrote during the course of the campaign. In many ways, he knows my positions better than I do because he authored a lot of them. Obviously, he ran them by me to make sure I was comfortable with the end result of the politics. And so getting to know him, especially on military issues, because I serve on armed services, is important. But getting to know him generally because he understands how I think, and just as importantly, he understands how to communicate to me, right? He understands, what the boss just isn't going to look at anything this long. You need to present it this way or that way. So knowing staff is awfully important. Knowing my chief of staff in Richmond, who is Abby Easter, and knowing that her primary concern is making sure I look good and get reelected, because she's been with me all these 20 years, is important. Knowing Keenan Austin Reed, who is my deputy chief of staff here in Washington, who's teaching us how Washington works and how the building works, is awfully important. So you're not going to get to me, you're not going to get to see me nearly as much as I would like to see you, because this was a mind-blowing experience for me. In the General Assembly, I saw everybody. It was expected that you were going to see whoever wanted to see you. That just can't happen here in Congress, but I've got a trusted group of people who I trust that will represent me correctly and will inform me of what you've said. I actually get a written report at the end of each week summarizing the activities of the staff, so I know who's come by, who's asked for what, and what our response has been.
Congressman, I want to talk about people's frustration. I hear two levels of frustration, and the gentleman asked you about one, but before we get to that one, what about when people say, even if we go and we talk to the congressman, it's just not going to make a difference at this point? Like, just even when efforts can't achieve an immediate result, is it still important to engage in them, I guess is what I'm trying to ask you.
Absolutely, because, I have, in the course of my service in the General Assembly, I have seen the majority change hands 3 times. And I suspect I will see that happen in the Congress. And so while you are advocating with me, and you should look at it as you're planting a seed, you're educating me, or you're educating my staff. And so when we do come back into the majority, and it will happen, I believe it will happen next year. I might be right, I might be wrong, but it will happen. You would have planted that seed, you would have established that relationship, and we'll know where you are on this issue, and we may have even adopted your position. We're ready to run because now we've got the 218 people needed to get the measure passed.
And one of the things I said, I don't know if you were here, Congressman, was that presidents come and go, but Congresses last forever. The same thing can be said about governors in Virginia. In Virginia, the governor can serve one term, 4 years. You were in the legislature for 20 years.
Right.
So planting a seat with you as opposed to planting a seat with the governor, it seems like you were the better bet if I was trying to pick and choose, right?
For over time, absolutely.
Yes, sir.
Absolutely.
How, in this particular political climate, how do we talk to members of the Congress who are not on our side, or who maybe don't see eye to eye with us on a certain issue? Should we even talk to them anyway?
Absolutely, you should talk to them. And, you know, so they don't see eye to eye with you, they're not aligned with you politically. So you've seen your advocacy tips. One of the most important tips that you saw there was, I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, tell them why it's in their enlightened self-interest to be aligned with you on this issue. Because you represent X number of people in their district, because you can provide access to, you know, people that they don't normally talk to, because at the end of the day, we all want to get reelected. And we'd all like to get reelected with 100% of the votes. So the notion of being able to expand our majority into areas where we don't normally have access to is enticing. And even if that doesn't do the trick, allowing them to understand the converse, which you don't have to say, but the converse obviously is that we're going to be laying in the tall grass waiting for you come election day. That doesn't need to be stated, but you know, the fact that you came and advocated obviously means you're organized enough to want to do that and to be able to do that. And then finally, do talk to them in terms of the effect on their constituency. You know, you've talked to them a little bit, you've hinted to them a little bit about your ability to influence the next election cycle, but do absolutely talk to them about how this affects their constituency, because to a member, all 435 of us, we need to hear that.
What about a friendly member? Do I say, I don't need to waste my time with McEachin, we're on the same side
No,
of these
please
issues.
waste your time with McEachin for a couple of 3 reasons. One, there are shades of gray, right? I may not be where you are on every issue dealing with the environment. It's a big set of issues. And so you need to come by to make sure that I know where you are on whatever the issue that concerns you. Secondly, even if you know, because you've read it in the newspaper, you've heard me say it, I've articulated the position that you're in line with, you need to come and be the wind underneath my wings to remind me that I'm doing the right thing, to remind my staff to keep on keeping on. Because please understand that when the other side comes and tells us how awful we are and that we're spawns of Satan, and I have been called that already, and I've only been here 8 months. You know, that is something that every now and then we need to have counterbalanced by people who agree with us. So just reminding us that we're on the right track, that we're doing what you want us to do is powerful.
What advice do you have for young people? We got some young people in the audience who are enlightened to hear for the conference, the fact that they're here. What advice do you have for them on advocacy? How should they be building their history?
Well, again, I would encourage you to begin at the beginning, which is with the campaign. Volunteer for the campaign, and you know what? You may find yourself in Utah, for all I know, right? And you don't have but so many choices, and some of those choices are Republicans. Well, choose the most Republican who comes closest to being aligned with your set of views. Because we need you to do what I like to call missionary work if you're in that type of situation. Because if you can establish that sort of relationship with them so that they understand who you are and whose you are and will return your phone call, then you've gone a long way. You may still get a no answer, but you've gone a long way in being able to begin the process of influencing the legislator. And then I would ask you to stay engaged, because at some point, and not all of you think in these terms, but at some point we're going to need you to be the new president of the Urban League. At some point we're going to need you to be pollsters. At some point we're going to need you to be in the campaign game and even run for office. And so that would be my advice to you. This is a marvelous job. I mean, being a member of the United States House of Representatives, it just doesn't get any better than that, right? And so I would encourage you to think seriously about being an elected official. And if you want to have that conversation, we probably ought to have another seminar.
That's right.
But I would encourage you to think about it.
So the gentleman asked the question earlier about you're an African-American member in the United States Congress. You belong to the Congressional Black Caucus, which is a caucus of a minority number-wise. And as a Democrat, you're in the minority. How effective can you be?
So, and he was a reporter, so he's left, and I shared some thoughts with him, and I'll share it with you as well in the same fashion as I shared it with him. His question assumes some things that aren't true. Number one, the Congressional Black Caucus is one of the largest caucuses within the Democratic caucus, and so we are fairly influential, especially with leadership, and fairly persuasive as far as our views are concerned. That's number one. Number two, in the short time that I've been a member of Congress, I've been able to bring hundreds of thousands of dollars of grant monies into my district. Not because I'm all that, but because somebody took the time to say, hey, Congressman, can you help us out with this? And if you would just assume that I am a Democrat and a minority member of the Democratic caucus and I don't have any juice, you wouldn't have come to me. You may not have gotten the grant, maybe you would have, maybe you wouldn't have. But because you did, we were able to work together and get you some federal dollars to help with whatever mission you've chosen to take on. So that's another thing that I think was overlooked in this question. The other thing is his question assumes that everything is partisan. I know that's going to blow your mind, right? Because you might think everything is partisan. Well, everything is not partisan, not in the General Assembly of Virginia and not in the Congress of the United States. There are issues that don't get covered. And I'm not here to bash the media. They do what they do for whatever reasons they do it. But the issues where there is bipartisan cooperation oftentimes don't get covered. Like right now, we're trying to work together to do some things with rural broadband deployment. You know what? Because Virginia 4, which is what I represent, has got a whole lot of rural areas. Well, guess what? Virginia 5, who's represented by a member of the Freedom Caucus and who's also a freshman legislator, has got a whole lot of rural areas, and neither one of us has got broadband worth a darn. So, you know, there are efforts ongoing like that. So, again, that question sort of is the question you would expect from the media. It's the horse race question. Well, you can't win the horse race, so how can you be effective? And I hope I've just shown you that there are lots of ways that we can be effective.
Mm-hmm. Congressman, talk to us a little bit about local advocacy, city council, school board. How important is that? How does it differ, if at all, from congressional advocacy?
I don't really think it differs at all. I mean, you may have an easier time getting to your city councilman or your school board member. They have fewer staff, obviously. It's easier because they're local and, you know, they may live around the block from you. But it's the same techniques that you just heard articulated. You need to get your meeting scheduled. You need to know what you're talking about. And if I can add something that at least I didn't hear talked about, you need to know what the other point of view is too. And you need to be able to articulate that in a fair fashion, because oftentimes that member, whether it's a school board member or someone on my congressional staff, you may be the only person who had, just because of timing, who's bringing the issue to us. And we will ask you what is the other side of the story, so that we can get some sense of how the debate goes and, as we call it, run our traps. So it's the same thing at the school board level, the city council level. It's just as important that you engage in your advocacy there and you engage in electoral politics there, right? You know, it matters who your city council person is. It matters who your member of the state legislature is, because they're the ones who ultimately get to redraw some lines that are awfully important later on.
I want to talk to you about that, and I know that's not why we brought you here, but the question was asked at a panel I was recently at, where the person lived in a red state. And this was a lawyer, this was an educated gentleman who said, why does my vote matter when I vote for president? I'm going to be outvoted anyway. And so talk to us, you're in Virginia. Virginia, although it has been blue and purple last elections, why does it matter to participate in local elections, even if in the bigger elections the vote may be canceled out by someone else?
Because the way that red state got deep red is because the Republicans figured out that they needed to participate in local politics before we did, and took it a lot more seriously. So they got the school board members. And they got the school board members passing resolutions or whatever they pass, so that our children are taught certain facts and certain facts aren't being taught. And then they got the city council members, and then they got their General Assemblies, so that the lines will be drawn in certain ways, so that despite the fact that Virginia has voted Democratic in the last 3 straight presidential elections and have all Democrats at the statewide level, our congressional delegation, we only have 4 Democrats out of 11 because of the way the lines are drawn. So that's why it's important that you get involved and your vote does matter. But you have to vote all the way up and down the ballot, not just at the president, not just for your senator, not just for your congressman, but all the way up and down, and make the same demands. Folks, look, politics is a contact sport, which means what? You have to stay in contact with your elected official and place demands on them. That's how the system is meant to work.
Congressman, I'm going to ask you one more very important question. I want to open it up for questions, and this might be one of the most important questions. The new Star Trek, you looking forward to it?
Absolutely. I can't wait.
Sister, there's going to be a sister?
The sister's the main,
Sister's the
absolutely.
main character?
Yes, she is.
Yeah.
Yes, she is.
Yeah.
She's a lieutenant.
Yes.
And she's been trained in Vulcan philosophy, and I can't wait.
I can't wait. I can't wait. All right, at this point, I want to open the floor up for questions, and this has been great. Any questions? All right, I don't know. Go ahead. I think we can hear everyone. Yes, ma'am, in the front.
Yes, so my name is Tamika Spruce, and I represent Words on Wheels from Detroit, Michigan. So one of the things I'm really active about with Words on Wheels is we're fighting for housing for people with disabilities. So we were able to partner with a coalition of people, and so we were able to pass a housing ordinance so that there's more low-income people in the new developments in Detroit. But one of the issues is that the part that did not pass was the disability accessibility portion, so that there's more accessible units within, the developments in Detroit. So we tried to go back to the drawing board, like, what can we do? Because we were very active in the fight, and it was taken out. And we did, I did talk to one of the staff members who was trying to figure out why did that happen, and he told us, and he said, well, she might put it back in before it goes to the vote, but she didn't. So what are some tactics that we can use to get the vote passed or amendment?
You made it real clear I guess this was something that happened at the state level?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It was a Detroit City Council.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a saying that we've adopted in Virginia: if you can't change the minds, change their seats. And if somebody did that to you after you expressed how important it is that you have access and the ability to get into these facilities, to my mind, that's inexcusable. So especially, and thank you for your service, by the way.
Yes,
but I absolutely think that sometimes you have to take it out at the ballot box.
Okay.
And Congressman, sometimes things don't happen the first go around, right? It sounds like you had some success, but not all the success, and sometimes it's just important to go back and try it again, huh?
I thank you for saying that. I will say this: one of the lessons I learned from Republicans in Virginia is that they just keep coming.
Yeah.
They just keep coming, and until they succeed. And we need to take that same attitude. So in between the election cycles, if you don't change their seat, you just keep coming back at it, and eventually the wall crumbles and you have success.
Good question, though. Thank you.
Hi, Congressman McEachin. Hi, I'm from Petersburg, Virginia. So
yes, ma'am, how can I help you?
But I'm here for a different reason. And my question is, in the capacity that I work, a lot of the work that I do is related to outreach on behalf of corporations to talk to communities. And with past years of having a Democratic president, an African-American president, and the majority in Congress, a lot of companies realized there was an opportunity to salute and celebrate a narrative about communities that are traditionally underserved. And when Congress changed and the White House changed, I think a lot of companies question now, how important is that to their interests? And so my question to you is, how should I answer? What is my argument to them?
Your argument to them is that what they would want to have is a consistent record on those type of issues, that people of color and people who represent people of color and represent underserved communities have long memories, and we understand if you leave us when it looks like we're not in power, then we may not pay as much attention to you when we come back in power, because the one thing that we know is that the pendulum swings. Sometimes it swings slowly, sometimes it swings violently, but the pendulum swings. And there will be another African-American president. There will be a Democratic majority in the Congress. Virginia will elect a Democratic General Assembly again. And what you ought to be about, and you being corporate America, is doing the right thing. And as long as you're doing the right thing, you will be in good stead with these people in underserved communities. So that's what I suggest might be an appropriate response.
Great response. Question over here, Congressman.
Congressman, my name is Perry Paler, and I am a current defense attorney, former criminal prosecutor, former narcotics prosecutor, and I've seen in my practice, and it's my feeling that marijuana is the next civil rights issue. And I'd like you to speak upon, particularly as it relates in the states, the different levels of legalization in different states and how that impacts the view in Congress and the Fourth Amendment search and seizure rules. Because in Maryland,
There's not enough time in the day.
but you understand, because in Maryland, D.C., and Northern Virginia, we have different rules around the Beltway.
Right.
And young people of all ages, but in my practice, young people, some believe it's legal, some believe it's if you have a prescription, and police don't believe anything has changed, and then we have Congress and the federal law that has not changed.
Right.
And I have found that traffic stops are up because public usage is up. And has Congress or has the Black Caucus taken any position with regard to this? Because people are now smoking at bus stops. They're smoking in the subway. They're driving within their car. And now we have Supreme Court law that says smell of fresh marijuana, smell of burning marijuana is a reason to search. But in Maryland, less than 10 grams is a $50 fine. So in Maryland, you can smell like marijuana, still be subject to a search. And then it's more confusing than it was when I was a prosecutor 10, 15 years ago, when it was just illegal. And now the Maryland Supreme Court said, well, yeah, you can have marijuana less than 10 grams, and yes, you can smoke, but because the federal law has not changed, it's still contraband, and so now you're subject to a search, seizure, and arrest. And so it just seems like there's a disconnect, which has caused an increase, I think, in traffic stops and arrests. Is that too much, or?
There are some efforts in the Congress, interestingly enough, some by members from the Freedom Caucus, which is not where you would expect it to come from, to legalize marijuana. But you're right, a lot of the problems come because of our federal system. A state might do X, but if the federal government doesn't do something in concert with it, that creates some tension. Another example is just in Colorado, right? They've legalized marijuana, but they have to have a cash business because they can't run that money through the banks, because the banking system is still federal, and the federal government doesn't recognize marijuana as anything but criminal activity, and therefore you can imagine how the argument goes. I appreciate you raising the question. I will talk to my Black Caucus members about it. But as a caucus, we all are pretty much dedicated to criminal justice reform, which is a much broader topic than just the legalization of marijuana, but nonetheless, that's an important piece of it.
Thank you. Next question. There you go, brother.
Thank you for your time, Congressman, and thank you for your great questions, Don. My name is Ryan Brown. I am a local advocate for rural communities that are majority minority, but tax dollars are spent disproportionately in their communities. My question overall is there an incubator sponsored by the Congressional Black Caucus for members or younger generation that wants to come in and take the roles and seats that you guys have now later down in life? Case in point, which would be a great example, I think, is the Federalist Society. So if you know anything about the Federalist Society, they say that they don't agree with what the law is, they agree with what the law should be. And so they appoint their fellow individuals throughout the judiciary. They give them lawyer positions because they have such, like a fraternity. You have a fraternity, you put your fraternity on your resume, you're more likely to get an interview because of that. Well, in some cases. Is there an incubator from or within the Congressional Black Caucus that allows for that type of those relationships to foster over time and not just be a staffer and for a short amount of time and something like that?
To some extent, the answer is yes, and that's through our internship program, because that gives you the ability to, in our internship program also comes with a stipend, which most interns don't get, and so that allows you to be able to see the process up close and personal, And once you have something like that on your resume, I do believe it opens up doors in certain quarters. It is not nearly as formal as what you've made the Federalist Society sound like, but it is as close to an incubator as we have.
Great question.
Hi, Congressman, thank you for being here. Thank you, Don. My name is Goodwill Pierre. I'm a lawyer from Houston, Texas. It wasn't until I actually worked in Congress that I understand really what the purpose of a state representative was. All these years, I've never known that. And so as a result of this, my question is, from an advocacy perspective, do you think certain groups, do you think the better utilization from an advocate perspective to help to utilize a state rep would be to help them navigate the actual federal entities like VA, like, entities supposed to help certain people versus advocating for particular changes in law? What is the faster or the quickest way to get change from with your constituency in that area? Say, for instance, I needed something done that it was legal, but that a federal agency is actually the block. Utilizing from an advocacy perspective from that level versus what we traditionally do, go on Hill and try to change policy for the long run.
Right, you're asking, if I'm hearing your question right, sometimes you're suggesting that it's better to try to have a regulation changed or have
Or not so much, that could be good, but so much just picking up the phone and saying, hey, IRS in Houston, can you help this particular person?
Right, constituent service.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's all a function of what it is that you need, right? Obviously, constituent service is the thing that we have, as a member, we have the most control over, because, that's what our people are in place to do, is to work with our constituents and try to make government work for them. And so, again, it's hard for me to answer that question because it depends on the needs of whatever the advocacy group is, but oftentimes, you're right, it is just as effective, if not more effective, to try to identify the problem, as small as it might be, and get it fixed rather than trying to take a macro approach and having a whole sweeping changes of laws and regulations.
It's a great question.
Good afternoon. I'm Vanita Banks, past president of the National Bar Association. And there are two issues that I'm very passionate about. The first is the abolition of the Electoral College. I think its time has come. And I also think that the time has come for African Americans to obtain reparations for having built this country. And I'd like to get your views on those two issues.
So as to the first issue, the Electoral College, I absolutely believe it needs to go. Mm-hmm. I think it's, we have matured as a democracy. We expect that our president is elected by the majority of the people. Mm-hmm. And it is interesting to see that the only time the Republicans have carried the popular vote in my recent memory is Bush Kerry. That's the only time. Everything else, it was carried, the popular vote was carried by a Democrat. So I am encouraged by some of the things I see. There's a push right now. Sadly, only blue states have joined, but there's a push right now to enter into a compact. And that compact would suggest that if the popular vote goes in a particular fashion, those states will cast their electoral votes in that fashion, regardless of what happened within their states. The compact only gets kicked off when you've assembled the right number of electoral votes. In other words, when 270 electoral votes worth of states have joined the compact becomes activated. So that's encouraging, but again, right now it's only blue states doing it, and that's not going to get it done. As to the second issue of reparations, you and I both know the challenges with that, right? Because, and I'm not picking on our president, I'm just saying that Barack Obama was not part of the African diaspora, right? So if you're talking about children of the African diaspora being the ones who get reparations, we've got to be very particularized about what that looks like. I am descendant from both slave and freed African Americans, or African Americans who managed to get their freedom at an incredibly early time. I'm just learning this. Do I get the same level of reparations as someone who's descendant from just nothing but former slaves. So we've got to work out all those issues. And when you come up with the answer and publish the book, we'll put forward the legislation.
All right, time for one more question.
Congressman, how you doing? My name is Ray Shackelford. I am the Southern Region Vice President for the National Urban League Young Professionals.
You need a new wristband, though.
Oh no, this works very well for me, as you see right here. But I also serve on the Independent Police Oversight Board for the City of Houston back home. And so you mentioned criminal justice reform, and as we know, that's like you said, a very broad issue. There's a lot of different issues that you have to address, but specifically as it relates to police interaction, accountability, things of that nature. When you're looking at body camera training, what is the Congress or the caucus working on right now to address those things?
I'm not sure that there's any, what the efforts in the Congress might be right now. I know that within the caucus, obviously one of the things we'd like to do is to be able to provide local police forces with the money for body cameras. In my state of Virginia, my home county, Henrico County, which is fairly wealthy, was able to foot the bill for body cameras on their own. You just moved to, I mean, let's just take Petersburg, the city of Petersburg, which is in dire financial straits. I'm not sure what they've done body camera wise, but I submit to you they can't afford it. So we need to come up with a program that sort of evens out the body camera issue across the nation so that all localities can afford them and we don't have the excuse of it being unaffordable. In addition to that, obviously there are other storage issues. I was very disappointed to read, I'm sorry I cannot remember where this was, but I knew this was going to be a problem eventually. I think it's somewhere in Virginia where prosecutors have just given up on the body camera system because it's too much information, right? I mean, they've got to sit there and they've got to look at the whole film, and there aren't enough hours in the day to look at the whole film so they can figure out what should be admissible and what shouldn't be admissible and all those sorts of things. So obviously we need more support for our prosecutors so that this information can be useful. I think that answers your question, but if I left out an aspect, come back at me.
Well, see, also, just as it relates to accountability for officers, even with the body camera, we've seen where young men are getting killed.
Yeah, and one of the last cases that I tried that actually settled was a young woman who was actually a passenger in a car where the police officer was saying he was trying to shoot the driver. And we were able to obtain a settlement for her, but I can tell you that the law itself is incredibly tilted towards the police officer. What I would suggest to you is that we need to, as we think about this accountability piece, and we've already seen that we're not always going to get a conviction for any number of reasons, there can be a civil answer to a lot of these questions because these police officers all work for entities that have money and who have insurance policies. And even though you may have alleged that it's an intentional act, the sort of the moral obligation of the locality is still to step up and to pay for whatever judgment that might be entered. That being said, the tort law that surrounds police shootings is horrible. And that really needs to be changed, and that is something that is best effectuated on the local level or the state level.
Another reason why people should vote.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Brother Ray, we have a panel tomorrow. Lacey Clay, Congressman Clay, has a panel on policing tomorrow. I'll be moderating. You should come because we're going to be talking about a lot of those issues and what the caucus is doing as a whole. Well, Congressman, we are just thankful that you would take the time out of your, we know this is a very, very busy week for you, that you would take some time to come visit with the Urban League and our partners. And just thank you so much. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you for having me.
And I just say this, we ask our members of Congress to do stuff all the time. Congressman, it's reciprocal. If we can be helpful to you, you got to call on us to see to ask us how we can be helpful too. It's a relationship, and so we want to be there for you as well.
We'll do it.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break. We got a great panel. 3 o'clock, State of Black America.
Panelists, a warm round of applause. We're going to hear from them in a little while. It's my duty and my privilege to say welcome and to try to set this conversation up with the right context and with some framing around what we indeed want to do today. And after I set it up, I'll have an opportunity to bring on the very wonderful Crystal High, whose job it will be to moderate the discussion amongst all of these panelists. We know in the context that this weekend, the Congressional Black Caucus weekend, is a weekend that now for more than 40 years, in fact, pushing to its 50th year, when the African American members of the Congress of the United States banded together in the early 1970s to work to create a collective voice on behalf of not only black people in America, but urban residents and all locked out and left out Americans. And the Congressional Black Caucus weekend certainly has always had its high point as the annual gala dinner, which takes place on Saturday night. But all of us should know that from the very beginning of the weekend, there was a component devised by CBC members back in the 70s of substance. In the early days, those brain trust meetings and forums and workshops took place on Capitol Hill in various committee rooms on the House of Representatives side. As time went on, the brain trust conversations outgrew those committee meeting rooms and were moved over first to the Convention Center, which is now demolished, and later to this building, the Walter Washington Convention Center. And this gathering has always brought together, yes, those who want to party, and it's okay to party. Give partying a round of applause. We got a party tonight, and I'll be disappointed if I don't see all of you there. But it's also brought together people of substance, people, many who do party, who wanted to be a part of public policy discussions, political conversations around the myriad of important issues that face the nation and face our community. In those times of the 1970s, after the civil rights time, the passage of the 64 Act, the 65 Voting Rights Act, the 65 and 66 and 67 War on Poverty initiatives, and later in 1968, the Fair Housing Law, where we'll celebrate the 50th anniversary of that law. In the 1970s, it was a period of African Americans thrusting their way into public policy making circles, into elected offices in state legislatures, in city halls, on county commissions, in the Congress of the United States, in the cabinet agencies of the government, in the non-governmental agencies and organizations that impact public policy. It was a time of push and progress, a time where people said, now that the laws have changed as a result of protest and litigation and struggle, and the vote has been fought and won and earned, let us deploy that new power to impact the decision-making that can truly change the fortunes and change the quality of life for our people in America. We need to know and understand where all of where we are and what we do began. It was also in that time, in the 1970s, when my predecessor, the illustrious great American and great strong black man Vernon Jordan, who was at the helm of the National Urban League in the 1970s, came up with the concept of the State of Black America report. Now, many of you have heard me say this before, but for those of you who have not, it was inspired by Vernon Jordan watching President Ford give his 1976 State of the Union address, in which he talked about a wide range of issues in the country. Never once used the term urban or poverty or black or civil rights or disadvantaged, and as though the State of the Union pretended a nation that did not include people of color or people who were economically disadvantaged. So Vernon Jordan said, let's do our own thing. And he brought together in the 1970s distinguished public policy experts and scholars from the African American community to put together a report called The State of Black America. That report continued almost interrupted in publication all the way through the report we issued in the spring of this year over at the National Urban League Washington Bureau and the Howard Theater. In 2003, when I joined the National Urban League and looked at the report, I said that this report needs to be enhanced and improved. Because the question in the early 2000s, there was an underlying question that we hear from time to time, and that question was, well, are all of these civil rights organizations even needed or necessary or relevant today? In fact, there was a poll by a fancy organization with a fancy name, and they issued a report and they asked Americans, is racism over? Are racial divisions a thing of the past? Is any of this even relevant? And surprisingly, large numbers of Americans, including some African Americans, answered in the affirmative, that now we were living in the land of milk and honey, that it was an abundant, flowing waters of justice and righteousness and prosperity everywhere. This is 02, this is 03. I said, we need to delve. Let's get some facts out on the table. And with the Brain Trust at the National Urban League, we created this measuring stick called the Equality Index, which actually looks at comparative information and data on blacks, whites, and Latinos, the joblessness rate, the poverty rate, the death rates, the high school graduation rates, third grade and eighth grade scores, the voter registration numbers, the home ownership numbers, the voter turnout numbers, 300 sets of data to ask ourselves, is there and are there still disparities in America? I don't have to tell you what the answer was. The answer was clear, that these disparities existed. And we looked at the disparities as a whole, and we looked at it in subsets of economics, education, healthcare, civic engagement, and social justice to see where the widest, if you will, gaps exist. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the polar opposite of fake news. This is real news and real numbers and real information. So every year since 03, we've released this index. And in the last several years, we've done some other very interesting things. We've looked at the jobless rate, the black-white jobless rate in the top 70 cities in America. We've looked at the black income level and the white income level in the top 70 cities. We looked at graduation rates and high school, if you will, attendance rates by states. What we are doing with this is try to give to all who are decision makers or who want to be decision makers in the elected sphere, in the appointed sphere, in the public policy arena, a tool that can be used to help shape public policy. Politics alone means nothing. Politics that translates to progress through public policy is where the game is. Just getting elected or electing people who have no agenda, right? Who have no agenda, they like looking fancy and walking around, is not what this is all about. So our effort with the state of Black America has been to annually frame this conversation. And this year, as we released the State of Black America report, we did another examination. And that examination was an examination of the performance of Barack Obama. And I thought we needed to do the examination not in a gossipy, opinionated format, but to look at what in fact occurred insofar as it relates to the nation and Black people during the administration of Barack Obama. And I'm going to share that with some highlights from that with you in a minute, because we need to be armed with facts and information. It's one thing for people to say, well, I don't think Barack Obama did enough about this, did enough about that. In fact, I didn't get an invitation to the Christmas party or the state dinner, or get my picture with Michelle, Sasha, and Malia. That's not the kind of analysis that we did. That's not what we're talking about. So in the overall index, it demonstrates that wide disparities in America still exist. Black people index in 2016 at about 72% of where white Americans are in all 5 categories. That number has changed very little on an overall basis in the last 12 to 14 years. It hasn't changed because what we've seen is some things go up and some things go down, but the overall number has not in fact changed. Where we did see some change that is worthy and notable is when it comes to health disparities. The Affordable Care Act has made a difference. It's making a difference in health disparities. It's making a difference in the number of African Americans who have insurance and access to doctors, if you will. So we looked at that, and so it's 72%. We looked at white Latino numbers. Latinos are at about 75% of where white Americans are and index very closely to African Americans in most categories, index ahead of us when it comes to overall economics. So we did that, and that report and those numbers are available to you at stateofblackamerica.org or NUL.org to the State of Black America report. I want to encourage you to use that information and take advantage of that information. So with regard to President Obama, we scored President Obama as an excellent president. Our highest rating was superior. And we looked at, so one of the things we had to do when we evaluated President Obama is determine what's the standard by which you evaluate a president. So is it a comparison to his predecessor, his immediate predecessor? Is it, I call it the S on the chest comparison. Is it a comparison to Superman? Did he perform great feats and leap tall buildings with a single bound as we wanted him to? Or do we compare him to historic figures? Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, Lyndon Johnson. No, we thought that the way to compare a president is to look at the condition of things on January 20th, 2009, the day he walked in, and then look at the condition of things on January 20th, 2017, the day he walked out. look at the unemployment rate, look at the home ownership rates, look at the educational performance rates, look at health outcomes, look at all of these areas and just make a hard, dispassionate comparison. Because the question for a president is not how did he do, the question is how did we do? What happened for us and what happened to America on his or her watch, his watch. So when we did that, we found that in certain areas, and I'm not satisfied, nor comfortable, nor cheering about where the economic situation is for our community. But the fact of the matter is that the unemployment rate declined precipitously on President Obama's watch. Where we gave the president not good marks was when it came to housing, because we lost, people lost on an overall basis, and black people lost significantly, lots of wealth, lots of home ownership on President Obama's watch, notwithstanding the efforts to stabilize the marketplace. So our analysis, again available to you online, was favorable to the president, but fair and not a public relations puff piece, because we need to be very clear. And I said to people that as far as 45 is concerned, right, that we will do the same exact analysis. The only question is, because we do it when the president leaves office, will we be doing it before 2020?
Hope so.
Or doing it in 2020? Or doing it in 2024? So that's still an open question. So let me just, before bringing Crystal on, offer a few other comments. We're in a time where the call to action for us is to protect our progress and resist the rollbacks. There are significant efforts, as you know, underway on multiple fronts to erode progress in multiple ways. It's not just happening in our nation's capital. It's happening in state legislature after state legislature in America today, where people are trying to restrict access to the ballot box. It's happening right here in the Capitol, where once again, the ugly notion of throwing millions of people off of the healthcare rolls has surfaced in the United States Senate with another bad bill that is being confected and stirred up in the dark of night, in a closed room, without transparency and without light of what effect it'll have on people. It's happening when it comes to the blueprint called the budget, where we are battling yet an effort that reminds me of the effort of the Reagan years to trade guns for butter, to trade those things that we need in our community to add $50 billion to the military. We have our work cut out for us. But I believe that we are stronger, we're more resilient, we're more intelligent, we are as prepared as we have ever been. The only question is, do we have the fight? Do we have the courage? Do we have the nerve to fight intelligently and aggressively and passionately to protect our progress and to resist the rollback? So we've got a distinguished panel. I want to set that context, because what I hope we do today is not only be diagnostic, but we're also prescriptive. We can also talk about things and ideas, whether they take place in state government or the potential there, in city governments or the potential there, or through breakthroughs here in the Capitol, because they're glimmers of bipartisan opportunities on an issue here or an issue there. So we don't want to have a cable television conversation. We want to have a conversation which thinks and looks to the future and talks about the things we need to do. So thank you for coming. Join me in giving the staff of the Washington Bureau, stand up Washington Bureau staff, another big round of applause. My team in DC doing a fantastic job under the leadership of Don Cravens. And with that, it is my indeed pleasure to introduce the editor-in-chief of Politics 365. That's an online magazine focused on politics and public policy. This woman is an attorney by trade. She's worked on national civil rights and social justice issues for years and years. She's been recognized with numerous awards, featured on CNN, TV One, RTTV, USA Today, NBC Black, The Hill, Ebony, and Sirius XM. She is the editor-in-chief of Politics 365, Crystal High.
Good afternoon, everybody. How are you doing today? Great. Good afternoon. Okay. We're going to get there. We're going to get there with y'all. We're going to get some energy going. You know, first I just want to thank Mark, the National Urban League, for the amazing work that they're doing and for assembling this tremendous panel. You know, when we talk about the state of Black America and the plan to propel us forward, I think there is no better forum than to have this bipartisan group of leaders here. And so a couple of ground rules after I do introductions, which none of you really need them, but that's okay. Brief introductions. I'm going to start the conversation with each of you being responsive for about 1 minute to the state of Black America, and then we really want this to be an interactive dialogue. So it's not just going to be talking heads up here. We're going to be going back and forth. I think we're going to have a mic if you have a question. So as the spirit moves you, just throw a hand up if somebody says something particularly compelling, and we're going to get this party going. So first, to my immediate left, we have the former president and CEO of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He is a partner at Cape Ward Capital, a board chairman of the Southern Elections Fund, and one of the John L. Weinberg Goldman Sachs visiting professors at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School. Most notably, he is going to be Maryland's next governor, Ben Jealous.
All right.
Next to him, we have the lovely Mayor of Baltimore, Catherine Pugh. Mayor Pugh has been a public servant for more than 15 years. She was elected to Baltimore City Council in 1999. In 2005, she was appointed to the House of Delegates of Maryland, and then she served in the Maryland Senate beginning in 2006. She is the former president of the National Black Caucus of State Legislators and holds a variety of distinguished accolades to her name. Next to her, we have Mr. Elroy Saylor, who is the co-founder.
We gotta give that sister a round of applause.
We have Mr. Elroy Saylor, who is the co-founder and CEO of J.C. Watts Companies. They manage one of the most prestigious and oldest partnerships here in DC, Watts Partners. He has done a variety of things in both public and private service, including most recently serving on the 2017 Presidential Transition Team, focusing on HUD, education, and treasury. Thank you for bringing your perspective to this conversation. And finally, we have Dr. Wes Bellamy, congratulations, Dr. Bellamy, who is the Vice Mayor of Charlottesville, Virginia, and the youngest individual ever to be elected to the Charlottesville City Council. And now I want to say for each of you, we could go on for quite some time with all of your accolades, but really I want to get into the meat of this conversation, which is the state of Black America. Where are we currently? Where have we made gains and progress? And where have we yet to realize some of that progress? I want to start with you, Ben, and then go on over.
Sure. The state of our community is split. Since Dr. King was assassinated, the upper middle class in our community has quadrupled in size. And blacks in poverty have not gone down 1 percentage point on average. Our strength comes from us moving as one community. The moment that we split into two, all of us will suffer more. And we have a choice, those of us who are leading at this moment, whether we double down on practicing a politic that lifts all of us up and, quite frankly, disproportionately those who are still stuck in poverty, or we kind of let that momentum continue, where half of us keep doing much better and half of us stay stuck. The good news is that, as has happened, I'd say, with each generation of black leadership, the youngest leaders in our community have made it quite plain that we cannot be tolerant of persistent poverty, that we cannot be tolerant of the police brutality that's used to enforce resegregation in its most extreme way. And so I am hopeful, so long as we, as Mark laid out so plainly, have the fight and the nerve to speak truth to power, to organize, and to make sure that all of us are lifted up, even as we now, many of us are privileged to have the choice to ignore half of our community. We are each called by our ancestors to make sure that our leadership is first and foremost beneficial to those who are struggling the most.
Thank you.
First, let me say thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel. And I believe that we are in a flux in the sense that we need to hold leadership accountable, especially those who are elected in cities such as Baltimore, where 67, almost 70% of the population is African American. Because what I always tell folks is that government does two things. It provides services and opportunity. And for too long, we've been left out of the opportunity. When you look at, for example, our city, where you see boarded up house after boarded up house after boarded up house, and communities that look like they've been bombed out, the question becomes, how long do we allow that kind of devastation to exist in our neighborhoods and communities? And what I often say is, and I heard this line from Shonda Rhimes, and I love this line. She says, you know, we should act normal. Diversity is normal. Inclusion is normal. And when I walk in a room and it's not diverse, the first thing I say is there something wrong with this picture? And so we have to make sure that leaders are accountable. I have the opportunity as a leader of my city to continue to enforce regulations and my vision on how we diversify our economy in such a way that we lift the least while we lift all. And that we realize that we do have those in our own communities who have capacity and capability, that we don't always have to be the subcontractor, we can be the majority contractor. When I required the state to diversify its pension portfolio, which was $40 billion, and we were only getting $300 million of that $40 billion, what I said to them is our state is 1/3 African American, our Latino population was 8 to 10% Latino, and our Asian population is 3%. So if you don't understand what normalcy is or diversity is, then look at the folks who are investing in those portfolios. So we've gone from something like 40 billion, from 300 million to 5 billion, not enough, but we can do better. It's how we push forward and recognize our roles as leadership and not be afraid. And I think Moriel said it best, you know, we can't afford to go back. We need to go forward, and we need to hold everyone, including ourselves as leaders, accountable for that. Not the media, not those who stand on the outside and throw stones. And as I tell folks, when I do a call to action, it's calling everyone to get into the action. We can change America, we can change our cities, we can change our state, but it's how bold we are in our leadership. And I tell folks every day, I pinch myself that I get to do this work.
Thank you all for being out this afternoon. And Mr. President, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. Look, I think it's like James Dickens in the book said, it's the best of times and worst of times in America. It's a tale of two cities. You know, when I go back to Haymarket, my enclave out 62 miles outside of DC, people are driving nice luxury cars, they're living in nice homes, they're saving, they're investing, their kids are going to great schools. But when I go back home to Detroit, the poor neighborhood that I grew up in with 42 cousins, 18 aunts and uncles, and being raised to Grandma Nancy and Viola Jessie Saylor, my folks back home are struggling. So when you look at the scales of justice, when you look at the scales of education, when you look at the scales of healthcare, when you look at the scales of criminal justice reform, those scales are not weighted this way, meaning we're on top. Those scales are weighted this way, meaning we're still at the bottom. And that gap on that scale is still far too high for many African Americans. Now, I'm a praying man. I believe I love the Lord. And I believe that this is the best of times because I traveled to 100 barbershops over the last 6 months of the campaign. And I saw strong black men. I saw brothers hungry for opportunity. I saw men and boys hungry for education, the desire to learn. So I think it's the best of times from that perspective. I went to beauty salons. I saw women and females ready to sign the front of the check, not the back of a check. I saw women and females ready to get married and have a family and grow our economy and start their own business. So again, I think with the leadership of folks like with the Urban League and individuals at the NAACP, our CBC members, our friends on the right, Tim Scott and guys like that, I think it's the best of times. And we have nothing but opportunity, daylight, and prayer in front of us.
It's a nice shout out to Tim Scott. I would be remiss if I didn't first and foremost give honor to God and thank you all for having me. Thank you to our national chairman, and also must give a shout out to the Richmond Urban League and the YPs. My sister Shamisha Bowen. Without Mimi, I'm not even quite sure I would be here right now. And I feel like I'm at a family reunion. I see my brother Carlos and Greg, and I saw my big brother Marlon walk in, so I'm good. Let me also say, I guess my youth will show sometimes, while I may be an elected official, I don't consider myself a politician, so my answers will not sound as such. To answer your question, I feel like we're in the best times ever. I'm very ecstatic about where we are as an African-American community. One, because when I look out and I see data that shows that African-American women are the leading class and the most educated group of people in the world, that makes me very happy, especially as a father of 3 daughters. I know that when I walk around, it's really funny you brought that up. I was in Baltimore coming back from New York literally last weekend. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. I had to get some checkers. And I stopped in what many would see, many would call probably just a place of poverty. It was 2:30 in the morning. Little brothers out in the corner. They should be getting ready for school the next day. It was a Monday night, and I remember stopping the car after I got my checkers, eating my fries, got out, talking to them and asking them about what do you want to do moving forward. And while they may not have been making the best decision at that point in time, they all knew and they had a glimpse of hope that they could go and do something moving forward. And they had the idea that their dreams were bigger than their neighborhood. Their dreams were bigger than their blocks. And when I think about the country as a whole, specifically who we are, and specifically this generation, we have a group of unapologetic black leaders. And I'm not talking about nobody else. I'm talking about black folk. Unapologetic black folks who are in leadership positions who are willing to say our time is now. And while we may have had those individuals before, in my personal opinion, unlike any time before, we can mobilize through social media and galvanize the masses with the click of a button or a tweet. We can now be able to go and demand in any space that we want, whether that's at a legislative office, whether that's at a congressional black caucus, whether that's talking to a bunch of white contractors, and we can say that we want in on these spaces now. And not only can we say we want that, we're gonna get it. And we're not gonna leave until you make sure that we get what is owed to us. And to me, that's equity. When the city of Charlottesville and I presented this equity package, a $4 million package of what some people are calling reparations, and I said that this is gonna specifically be for black folks and marginalized communities, and that passed 5-0, I don't know if that would have happened decades before. So yeah, some people may say that we still have a lot of work to do, which I would not combat that. I wouldn't disagree. We're always gonna have a lot of work to do. When a group of people have a 400-year head start on us, yeah, there's gonna be some kind of a gap. But that doesn't mean that us as a people right now aren't moving forward, aren't progressing forward. And I believe that this generation, with the tutelage and the wisdom of the elders who are giving it to us, I see my brother Tim walk in, right? Like brothers like that, they give us their knowledge, and the older elders continue to pass down that wisdom. We may go about it a different way. That creates this energy that is undeniable. And we're gonna get what's ours. You can believe that.
So I want to take, we can do applause. So I want to take what you're saying though about like the energy, the enthusiasm, the belief that there is something better and we can obtain that, and how do we really marry that to practical policy decisions? Because I think what we would find is that there is concern, particularly under the current administration, that, you know, policies are being rolled back, that we're not as actively engaged. You know, we're seeing, which I think is great, a lot more activity at the state and local level, because federally, who knows what's happening at any given time? So how do we marry that? How do we take the energy, the protests, the Twitter activation, like social media, all of that, and frame some more concrete policy solutions?
Yeah, well, you see it being done, right? You see policies being written on a local level, statewide level, and even there's a mirage of some individuals on the federal level trying to push different initiatives. Me as a local elected official, I think it's important that we continue to put the pressure on our local electeds to make sure that they write policy that is specifically going to create equity, not equality, because those are two different things. Equity means that everybody gets what they need in order to be successful. Equality is giving everybody the same thing. So we make sure that we use and we use our collective power and we force our elected officials to create policy that leads us to equity. And with that equity, with the protests, with the activism, or however else you want to call it, we then mobilize these individuals to get in the streets and get in the community. Listen, we also got to do something that may make some people uncomfortable. And again, I don't consider myself a politician, but all of these elected officials who are worried about getting reelected or playing the game, that's what's holding us back. At some point, we're going to have to say the plight of our people and the plight of us being empowered is more important than a vote 4 years from now. Me personally, I'm not as concerned with getting reelected as I am with making sure that I can do everything that I can for our people to get what they need right here, right now. So when we talk to our other individuals who are running for office or in these positions, we need to ask them, how long do you consider yourself to be in this game? How long you plan to be in this game? And are you going to tell me one thing and tell Sam from over there, who may not look like me, you're going to tell me one thing, tell him something different, and then more than likely go with him because he can give you a bigger check than me? And if the answer to that question is yes, then we need not vote for those individuals. Or better yet, like my grandma say, if the fruit from their tree bears that, they will say yes to them and also give us some bull crap. We need to watch that and not vote for them.
So I see Mayor Pugh and Ben, y'all want to jump in?
Well, let me just say, I think it is our responsibility to push the envelope. And as a mayor of a major city, I've been able to do that. But more importantly, it's making every single, I have a $3.8 billion budget. And so when I walked in as the president of the finance board, everybody turned around and looked. It's like, well, why are you here? Well, the mayor usually doesn't come. Well, according to the charter, the mayor is the president of the board. This is where, this is where the decisions are made, so I'm here. And, you know, I get to say, excuse me, you know, who's doing this work? I don't have to tell you who to do the work with, but I can tell you what the population of my city is, and we ought to be doing work with other folks that look like me as well. The same thing with the Board of Estimates. Our Board of Estimates is where every single contract that is let by the city comes in front of. And when I walked in on my first pre-board meeting, well, actually, I walked in on a pre-board meeting early in my administration. I didn't know what was going on. Everybody was sitting around the table. I said, well, I didn't call a meeting. And so they said, well, Mayor, if you walk in, somebody has to walk out. Well, what I found out at the Board of Estimates backroom meeting was that page 1 through 79 was routine. I said, well, how is it routine? I didn't have a look at page 1 through 79. Well, I made them go through every single page. What I learned was that there is a meeting before the meeting, and it is the mayor's meeting, okay? And the mayor oversees every single contract. So I get to say, excuse me, why is this 27% and 3%? Because 27%, they said, well, 27% is the goal. I said, well, the goal doesn't mean that that's the top of it. You know, the goal should be the floor, not the ceiling.
Right.
And so I need to see contracts where it more resembles our population. But the other side of that, when you think about the administration and infrastructure, most of us are running cities that have old infrastructure. Right. Billions of dollars that we know will be spent over the next decade or so. So we have a responsibility to make sure that people in our community are getting opportunities to participate in those contracts. How do you get on those lists? Who created those lists? How are you making sure that folks are trained in your neighborhoods and your communities to do that work? And I think that means being bold, being focused, and understanding the economics of your city and what's available and should be available to all.
Ben?
The game has been at the state and the local and county level for a long time. I think perhaps more of the crowd at CBC Week is attuned to that now that Donald Trump is in office and the far right wing controls every branch of our federal government. But you look at the last couple of Congresses, the average number of bills passed, about 250, 10% for the renaming of post offices, and the minting of commemorative coins in Congress. And yet we have to find a way to move our families forward. That's why Mayor Pugh, former Senator Pugh's work on increasing opportunities for black investment firms is so important. Not simply because of what you did in Maryland, but because it was replicated around the country. But that's why it's so important that our younger generation really look at how they can make an impact in the 20 metro areas where 85% of black people live, in the states especially south of the Mason-Dixon, where we are clustered. You know, I'm proud to be one of 3 black folks under 45 running for governor right now in the South. And the reality is that if our generation is going to move our communities forward, if we're going to make sure that everybody has health care, it's going to happen at the state level if it happens anytime soon. If we're going to make sure that there's a good teacher in every classroom, it's going to happen at the state level. If we're going to make sure both that there is more investment in our businesses, it won't happen under Donald Trump, but also that there's more jobs, say, in the building trades as we're building these roads and bridges for our people. It'll happen because our local and state leaders stand up and require that folks are hired from our communities too. And so we have, I think, a responsibility, those of us who are elders of any sort, and when you're the nation's youngest retired civil rights leader, you become an elder of sorts. To be very clear with the younger generation that while there is still very honorable and it's important to aspire to federal office, if you want to make change right now, do it at the state level, do it at the local level, because that's where we have the power to move quickly at the speed that our people need progress.
Thank you. Elroy?
Yeah, I think we've gotten some very good comments from our elected officials and from Ben, who's run a major organization. I want to respond from the perspective of a small businessman, and not because of my stature, but because of my revenue. I'm a small businessman.
Sorry. Let it be noted that you're the only one who made a short show.
Sorry.
Come to Baltimore, we got some business.
But on the serious note, you know, I learned at an early age growing up in Detroit that the biggest coward in the world is capital.
Amen.
The biggest coward in the world is capital. Capital will not flow to an unfriendly marketplace. The mayor knows that, vice mayor knows that, and I know Ben knows it. But if our tax system is too high, if our regulatory relief is not solid, if our education system and our workforce is not there, if we don't have the proper health care for our residents so that they can get to work, if we don't have a good transportation system so people can get back and forth to work, if we don't do something with energy so we can reduce the energy prices so people can drive who are fortunate to have a car, we can't create jobs. And I tell you, friends, a poor person has never created a job. I don't have anything against poor people. I grew up poor. But a poor person has never created a job. And what do I mean by that? We've got to create some wealth. As I said earlier, I like signing the front of the check. My dad signed the back of the check his entire life, with no more than a high school degree. But he put 3 kids through school. Now, practically speaking, what do those points mean? I'm gonna put my policy hat on for a second because I served in the Senate and the House and in the governor's office. and the elected officials could appreciate this, there is some policy in Washington. Some things are getting done, but you got to get past all the fog. There's some bipartisan legislation right now with Tim Scott and Cory Booker. I see some CBC members here, and we hope you all can get involved and jump in on that. But Ron Kine and T. Berry in the House are working on it, and it's called the Opportunity Act. It does three things. Capital gains, it's going to reduce that a little bit more. There's $2.3 trillion right now out there in the marketplace, and I've tried to access it. It's there. But as I said earlier, it's not going to unfriendly markets because it's a coward. It's going out to Haymarket where I live. They just built a Best Buy, a Walmart, a major mixed-use facility out there. But it's not going to my home city of Detroit, at least once you get out of downtown. So this legislation calls for reducing that capital gains tax so that corporations could put more money back into these urban areas. 2, it calls for a zero pool fund. And what that's going to do is for small businessmen like myself, it'll allow 100 more people like me to pool their resources, create a fund, and then invest that money into underserved communities. And that's the zero pool fund inside that legislation. And then lastly, it will designate, similar to what Bill President Clinton did, similar to what President Bush did with the empowerment zones and the enterprise zones, it'll create another classification of zones up to poverty rate of X, a low unemployment of X. But that's a particular bill that I would encourage everyone in this room to read up on. Our brother over here talked about the access to technology. Call your senator, call your congressman, call your mayor, call your governor, and say, let's take a look at the bill. The bill is still in committee, so it's not final. If it's something in it that you don't like, lobby to get it taken out. If it's something in it that you like, lobby to promote it. If it's something else that you want to see in it, now is the time to lobby to put it in there. But there's a really good piece of legislation, and the Congress is trying to do something on tax reform. This helps our community. It helps small businesses. But so on the practical side of it, capital is a coward. It's not going to go to unfriendly markets. Those scales that I've talked about, there's huge disparities, but we've got to get revenue into our community so that we can begin to change some of those skills.
So here's what's interesting about this idea, because I think within the last week and a half, you know, when you talk about capital, right, there's a contingency that wealth is involved in the equation. And 2 studies came out, one saying that by 2053, the median wealth of African American families will be $0 by 2053 if trends persist as they're going, and that African Americans are the only group in the country making less today than they did in 2000. And so how do we juxtapose, on one hand, this understanding that capital and industry help bring jobs and opportunity into our communities, and on the other hand, saying that so many in our communities are ill-equipped to take part in that market? How do we start to work through that challenge?
Well, first of all, I think that we have to realize that we do have people who have capacity and capability in our own communities. And I think we have to dispel the myth that we don't have that. You know, even when we were looking for investment bankers to do work in the state of Maryland, they said we didn't have any. So I said, well, when we have the hearing, you'll see them. So we brought 141 investors from across the country to sit in that hearing room so that they could recognize that, in fact, we do. When we think about these contracts and so forth that are available, we have to be intentional about making sure that we're inclusive of our community to make sure that they're taking part in these opportunities. We need to be planning ahead when we talk about infrastructure. Infrastructure dollars are flowing. So we have to make sure that our communities are included. African American contractors are included. If you come to Baltimore City, you'll see the cranes up in the sky. Somebody's building. So how inclusive are we in allowing contractors of color to be included in that process? And when you think about neighborhoods, and there's also another study that says in the next decade, more people will be moving back to cities than ever before. So we got to make sure that while we're moving out, so we need to make sure that Black folk understand the importance of A, living in cities, 2, participating in the economics, and when we get money, that we know how to partner and build businesses and recognize that there are those out here there who are doing that. When I was in Miami getting an award for something I was doing with hotelers around the nation, a gentleman walked up to me and said, my son said, you're cool. I do manufacturing, and we just built a plant in Tennessee. I said, well, come to Baltimore and build a plant in Baltimore. So we just entertained him last week. And so it's our responsibility, our role, to reach out, bring folks, include folks. and educate those who are in our city. I made community college free in Baltimore. And when I did that, you know, I was slammed from the left to the right. And so I was told, and this is what was said to me: urban youth, quote unquote, don't finish Baltimore City Community College. And so I wrote back and I said, quote unquote, I'm an urban youth. And so I don't understand the connotation of urban youth, but and what they said was, you should be preparing them to go to work. Sure, some young people want to go to work, and we want them to go to work if that's what they want to do. Everybody doesn't have to finish college. But I said my role, my responsibility is to make our children reach beyond what they see. And then they went on to say, well, they could probably go to community college free anyway if they just filled out their FAFSA form. I said free is the operative word. Free levels the playing field. Their mothers don't push them towards college because they know they can't afford it. They don't reach for college because they don't think they can afford it. So filling out the FAFSA form is one thing, but knowing that it's free. And I walked down the hallway of an alternative school, and a young man yelled out of the classroom. He said, "Thank you, Madam Mayor, for making Baltimore City Community College free." I said, so walk with me in my community, in my neighborhoods. Give my young people hope. That's my responsibility. That's my goal. So all I'm saying, you all, is that we have people in our community who want to be engaged. As leaders, we have a responsibility to make sure that you can get engaged. Cut the red tape, open the doors, create the opportunity, and be inclusive and be diverse. That's what we're supposed to be as a country.
I'd like to jump in on what the mayor said there as well, piggybacking off of something. The mayor talked about our urban areas and this resurgence back in our urban areas. My partner and I, Chris Sack, we developed 2 Walmarts right here in Washington, D.C. If you go back to, I guess it was the 1988, and you look at the area by the MCI Center, and then that was kind of like Skid Row. That was a bad area. You go back to then the mid-1994, Bill Clinton was in the White House. We passed empowerment zones. Then 1998, I guess, the last 4 years of President Clinton's term, we then passed another piece of legislation called the American Community Renewal New Markets Tax Credit Act. It was one of the largest anti-poverty pieces of legislation that passed the Congress. J.C. Watts, Danny Davis, in the House, John Lewis, Jim Talent, several other folks in the Senate. The Abe Poland was the guy that developed all of that area right around the MCI Center. He was in our office lobbying J.C. Watts for that tax credit. There was probably over $100 to $200 million investment that went into that area. But when we started talking about the African-American contractors, when we started talking about how many of our folks were actually going to be employed, there was silence in the room. So when you start looking at just gentrification, when you look at urban areas where we were in the 90s, where we are today, these urban areas are definitely, Baltimore is on a resurgence. I go back home to Detroit, there's a resurgence there. So in closing, what's the point that I'm trying to make here, and piggybacking off of what the mayor said? If you have additional resources, if you have friends, if you have family members, one, I like to speak very practical. I encourage you to go into these urban areas and start buying property. Seriously. If it's a $5,000 lot, purchase it, and you've got to pay $89 a month on taxes on it, and maybe another $200 a month to do some maintenance on it, purchase it. If you've got more resources than that, go in and buy a building and just hold on to it. Because in my line of work, I've got a couple businesses, but on the construction side, I tell you, the Home Depots, the Walmarts, the Lowe's, the Best Buys, and as you look at technology, here's what's happening. They don't need these big box stores anymore, because I can go on this little phone and buy anything I want. So corporate America, they understand 2 things, friends. They understand profit and pressure. We've been applying pressure for a long time, but now they're starting to see again profit in our urban areas. So they come out of a commitment, they come out of compliance to our urban areas, because that's when we apply a lot of pressure, Urban League, NAACP, to mayors. But if we start applying and showing profit, they'll come out of a commitment. And it's different as a businessman when I come to your city and not come to your city because of a commitment versus a compliance. Because when it's a commitment, I'm seeing a partnership. Now I'm looking at investment, now I'm looking at jobs, and now I'm looking at partners. So again, for us to be a part of that, we've got to get in on the ground level. Look, these are our neighborhoods. We know our streets. I go back home all the time. I'm buying up this lot. I'm buying up that lot. I'll buy a $25 lot if I could and just hold on to it, seriously. But that's economic wealth. The mayor is absolutely correct. Our cities are where it's at. Technology is reducing the footprint in corporate America. Corporate America is coming back in our inner cities. Why do you think they're talking about doing tax reform? They want to reduce that corporate tax. President Trump wants to get this money back in America. They're not getting ready to build out in the rural countries. They're going right back in there. And it's not just because the black folks are there. You got the LGBT community going back in. You got the millennial goes in. And these folks spend money.
Okay.
So
One second, Wes. Let me get Ben and then you. But I also want to do a quick audience check. Show of hands. Any questions, comments, real quick, just so we. Okay. Thank you. Go ahead, Ben, and then Wes.
We need to start by recognizing our strengths. We oftentimes don't see them. We don't talk about them. You talk about how the media reports on black men, and we're so critical. And then you ask folks what they can tell you about the dropout crisis or incarceration rates. How do black men perform as entrepreneurs as far as new business starts? Where do we fall as far as groups most likely to join the U.S. military? Where do we fall as far as preparing our children for school each day, the way that I prepare mine? Twice the national average in opening new businesses, most likely to join the U.S. military, most likely to help their children before they start each day. That's not how the media talks about black men. That's not how we publicly talk about ourselves. I've co-founded a group called Be Me with a social entrepreneur named Trabian Shorters. We wrote a book called Reach to begin a national conversation about black men as assets. But you take that more broadly. I made the second most abrupt entrance into Silicon Valley investing after MC Hammer when I left the NAACP.
You too legit to quit?
Brother never quit, man. He went bankrupt like Donald Trump, but he didn't go broke. And early into Facebook, he was early into Google. He's an impressive, Hammer's impressive investor. And if you say, I think to most of us, break down the black middle class, most folks won't mention that blacks in IT rival teachers as far as numbers in our community, that the wealth in Prince George's County comes primarily from blacks in tech. And so when you look at how we actually build wealth in our community, we need to understand what's the positive that's already happening and how we build on that. And that's why recently, as we were talking about building the economy in our state, and there was a lot of talk about trying to recruit a major government agency, trying to recruit the FBI, for instance, into Prince George's County. I said, well, we also should be talking about recruiting Facebook into Prince George's County, because they're under two types of pressure. One, there's a million programmer shortage, and two, their inclusion stats for black programmers is less than 3%. Prince George's County alone, and this is a vein of town, goes all the way up to Baltimore City, cuts all up and down the 95 corridor in Maryland, all through the DMV where we're sitting right now. But Prince George's County is the epicenter of blacks in tech in this region, has 17 times more black programmers than Santa Clara County, where Google and Facebook are headquartered. But that's not how we see ourselves. And you can only really build on your strengths if you recognize them. And then if you're willing to speak to them proudly and get others to see them too.
So, thank you. I know we have to get to questions, so I'll be kind of brief. And I think, first of all, Brother Ben, you co-wrote the book Reach. I'm the president of our local 100 Black Men chapter, and we read Reach for all 100 of our summer academy boys last year, and it just really brightened up their eyes.
Oh, thank you, brother.
So, I really appreciate that. I think it's important to note that out. Let's give our brother another round of applause. That book is phenomenal. You owe me a cut for giving you a plug.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Absolutely.
But on a serious perspective, I agree with many of the answers, but I think to a certain extent, we're speaking at them from a 50,000-foot level, and then we're kind of just hoping magically that our people are going to get it. So, for example, and it's no disrespect to you, brother, but maybe I don't have $5,000 to go and buy a piece of property. Maybe I don't even have
$25.
Maybe I don't have to, but seriously, when we heard the gaps in poverty, a $25 piece of property could be the difference between you eating pork and beans and sausage at night or somebody not even getting groceries. Like, my mother and I, she used to tell me I couldn't even put milk in the oatmeal because don't waste that milk on no oatmeal, boy. You see what I'm saying? So, like, it's real, and we still have a lot of those same issues here. So how are we intentional in terms of building wealth from not only a local perspective, statewide level, but federal level? And I think it's a mirage of ways. So from a locality perspective, what we did in Charlottesville, we have 0.04%. Yes, that's less than half of 1% of our contract spending with black contractors. So the first thing I did was write a piece of legislation. We passed a resolution that has to change. We have to set a percentage requirement in terms of how we are going to contract with minorities, specifically African Americans. But it goes further than that. So you can't just say you have a piece of legislation. You didn't have to hire a position, someone whose sole job will be to go out and A, find black contractors, B, create convenings for black contractors or minority contractors, and then C, teach them how to go after the contracts. How do you bid on contracts? How do you go out and do the things to create wealth? So that's the first piece, right? And then when you go from, those are the adults. But then when you look at the children, the youth, the young men, the young women who want to get to that same piece, you have to be intentional on having positions for people who are going to teach our young people how to do these things. Listen, I got 2 phones, and I was on Twitter just now even while they was talking. This is what we oftentimes like to be on. Our attention spans are very short. So you need dedicated positions to teach people. This, specifically young people, if you want to be able to go on to make money, A, you don't have to go into college. But my job, we hired a position in the city of Charlottesville, a black male achievement coordinator. We call him youth opportunity coordinator for political reasons. But his sole job is to go and talk to African American males and women in the schools and teach them about their post-secondary options. With that is a contract with the local business for them to learn how to do contracting work, construction work, plumbing work. There's a myriad of different things that they have. But I had to specifically write that position into our budget. And that's where elected officials come into play. And then lastly, the work is also on y'all. The work is also on us. All of us in here with this wealth of knowledge, and we know how to do these things. How many of us are going to get out of the boardrooms but actually go in the neighborhoods and take an hour or 2 out of our day, or maybe 2 hours out of our week, and go and speak to a young person about the importance of doing this? Or better yet, forget speaking to them about it. Let's actually bring them on our jobs to show them exactly what you need to do. Let's create our own apprenticeship programs. The thing is, we got to stop asking specifically these white politicians or politicians in general, these people who have shown for decades that they are not concerned with how we build wealth. Why are we continuing to ask them to do it when we can do it ourselves? We're the ones that our ancestors are waiting for. It's us. It's not nobody else. I love Jesus, but I don't think Jesus is going to come in here and say, Wesley, go in there and make a contractor tomorrow. That's our job. We know how to do it, so let's go do it. Those are practical ways.
I'm going to come right back up to the panel, but I know we have 2 questions right here, this man with the blue tie and then the woman in the front with the black and white.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm a Maryland resident as well as a Baltimore City resident. So I have a 2-part question for Mr. Jellis as well as our mayor. Mr. Jellis, last year before you announced your candidacy, you mentioned about the role of wealth creation of Silicon Valley. I know you have some experience in that. So how would you, in terms of leveraging the power of Wall Street, can you explain how you would leverage your business acumen that you have for the state, but also, as you stated, that you're like the only Democrat running for the state of Maryland. And next question, apparently Governor Hogan has a rather apparently favorable position, and he's supporting the Amazon project. So can you speak, what would you do different that he may or may not be doing, as well as Mayor Pugh, how are you leveraging and supporting that project potentially to bring that to Baltimore, and how can African Americans benefit from that project? Thank you.
You know, I would like nothing more than to see Amazon come to Baltimore. We would be in a much stronger position to compete if he had not pulled the plug on the red line. when you go into the RFP and it says state-of-the-art public transportation, it's just hard not to, just admit that the governor made that much harder. As far as business, I'm proud that at Cape Port Capital, more than 60%, close to 70% of our companies have a Black, Latino, or female founder. In fact, perhaps the one that's performing the best right now has a Black Latina founder. And what we show through our investment is that our internal rate of return is widely respected in the Valley as one of the best. I run the Baltimore office. We're the only seed stage Silicon Valley headquartered firm with a Baltimore outpost. Mentor at Johns Hopkins Accelerator. And I'm proud that we show that you can have a very high rate of return by keeping your door open to everybody. And that's why it's so disheartening that our governor has launched a $200 million industry, and one day it'll be $1 billion industry, the medical cannabis industry, without one license going to a Black entrepreneur in a state that has some of the best Black entrepreneurs, some of the most famous in the entire country. Lastly, I would say that one thing that makes me different in this race is that I've been a CEO or a partner, CEO, admittedly leading nonprofits, or a partner in a business since I was 26 years old. And when you're a politician, and most politicians, there's a perverse incentive not to have hard conversations, for instance, about the budget, because it could cost you your re-election. But when you're a CEO in an NGO or in a for-profit company, and you don't have a hard conversation about the budget, about revenues, it could cost you your business or your job.